Hey everyone, nearly 95% of people who watch my videos haven't subscribed yet. If you're enjoying the content, I'd really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It means a lot. Also, be sure to give a video a like and drop a comment below. Your interaction helps more people discover the channel and supports its growth. Thanks a ton for being here. By the way, I'd love to know which country or city are you watching from? September 2015 sits clear in my memory because the air had started to change. The high country in the Colorado Rockies had that dry, cold smell that comes before snow, even though the sun still held warmth by midday. I was alone, moving slow through timber and open benches, marking elk movement for a seasonal survey. I had done this work for years. I knew the patterns, the routes between feed and cover, the way herds used wind and slope to stay hidden. That familiarity made the day feel routine at first. The terrain was a mix of lodgepole pine and broken granite. Fallen needles muffle my steps. I stayed just below a ridgeline, keeping the wind in my face. I was focused on tracks pressed into soft dirt near a game trail when I noticed a sound behind me. It was the scrape of a boot, light but clear, matching my pace. When I slowed, it slowed. When I stopped, it stopped. At first, I blamed my nerves. Solo days sharpen awareness. Wind shifts, branches fall, but the sound came again when I moved, the same distance back, the same timing. It did not rush or lag. It stayed even like someone keeping exact count of my steps. I stopped fully and waited. The forest settled. No birds, no wind, no insect noise. The silence felt shaped, as if something had pressed down on it. I dragged my boot across gravel. A moment later, the same scrape came back, softer but close. I coughed into my sleeve. The echo returned with a delay that felt wrong, like someone trying to copy me instead of a natural bounce of sound. I picked up a rock and dropped it. The clack against stone came back again, not from the slope or the trees, but from a spot that felt level with me. I turned fast, scanning downhill and upslope. There was nothing there. No movement, no color break. No sound. I stood still for a long time, long enough for my legs to stiffen. The silence did not relax. It stayed tight, focused on my back. I started moving again, slow, careful, watching my shadow stretch between trunks. The noise followed. It never rushed. It never fell behind. It felt measured, controlled. I could tell the distance now. Too close to be an echo. Too steady to be an animal moving on instinct. Elk make noise, but they do not copy. Predators do not mirror each step. My breathing stayed, even because panic wastes energy. I checked my position. I was more than 4 miles from the truck, with rough ground between me and the road. I angled toward thicker timber, hoping cover would break the line. The sound adjusted with me. When I changed direction, it changed. When I paused, it paused. I tested again by stepping onto a dead branch and snapping it. The return snap came back lower, like someone stepping where the branch had already cracked. That detail told me enough. Someone was behind me, close enough to watch my feet, careful enough to place theirs where mine had been. I turned fast again, committing this time, scanning wide. Still nothing. No face, no body, just trees and shadow. The silence, after, felt intentional, like a held breath. I started a steady walk toward a shallow draw that cut down toward creek. Water meant tracks. It also meant noise cover. As I descended, I noticed something else. The following steps shifted to stay upslope of me, keeping elevation. That was not random. That was positioning. At the creek, I crossed straight through, splashing more than needed. I bent low, pretending to study sign, then doubled back 10 yards downstream and climbed a steep bank. I moved fast and low, then stopped behind a cluster of fallen logs. I waited. The sound came again, delayed now by confusion. A step into water. A pause. Another step. Then nothing. I stayed frozen. My pulse hammered in my ears. After a minute, I heard fabric brush bark. A shape moved between trunks, slow and careful. A man stepped into view, scanning the creek where I had crossed. He wore muted gear, older, well-used. No blaze color. No pack that I could see. He carried a rifle low, not shouldered. His posture showed patience, not surprise. He was not lost. He was tracking. I stayed hidden. He moved past my position, eyes forward, focused on where he thought I was going. When he disappeared downslope, I waited longer than felt safe. Then I moved uphill fast, putting ground between us, breaking line of sight and sound. I did not stop until my legs burned. I reached a rocky spine where prints would vanish. From there I angled wide, using open ground and wind to keep awareness. The following noise never returned. I made it back to the truck near dusk, drained and shaking. Later, with daylight and distance, the details lined up. September meant archery season overlap and illegal scouting for rifle season. Someone had been shadowing me, using my movement to stay hidden, possibly mistaking me for elk sign or planning to push me toward a waiting spot. The copying sounds were deliberate, meant to mask his presence by blending into mine. A few days later, officials found an unregistered blind near that creek and boot prints matching the route. The area was closed for investigation. I never went back alone after that. What stayed with me was not fear of being attacked. It was the precision, the calm choice to follow, to copy, to stay unseen. The silence was not empty. It was controlled. It was early January 2016, and I was on my usual patrol in the park, driving the dusty service roads that cut across the desert. The sky was pale gray, the kind of light that makes everything seem muted and flat. The temperature had dropped overnight, leaving the sand and gravel cold under my boots. I had been alone for hours. The only sounds the low hum of the truck engine and the occasional scrape of wind carrying sand across the roads. My shift had been quiet, the kind of quiet that leaves you aware of every small movement and sound. Around mid-morning, the thermal alert came through in a mobile camera I had been monitoring. It was unusual for this time of year. The sensor showed a heat signature near one of the abandoned restrooms off the main trail. It did not have a recognizable shape, just a small, shifting warmth in the concrete structure. My gut told me to check it out. I parked the truck at the edge of the parking area and walked in, boots crunching over gravel and loose sand. The wind was light, enough to carry a dry, metallic taste across the space. The restroom was empty, the doors hanging slightly off their hinges, paint peeling in strips from the walls. I moved slowly, sweeping the flashlight across the floor and walls, trying to see any sign of the source of heat. Nothing moved. The stalls were small, lined with old concrete walls stained from years of neglect. I stepped into the first stall and paused. That was when I felt it, a subtle vibration under my feet, faint at first, almost like the thrum of a far-off engine, but irregular. I froze, bending slightly to touch the floor with my hand. The concrete was solid, but I could feel movement beneath it, slow and deliberate, spreading like a wave across the ground. I stepped back, scanning the area, but the heat signature had vanished. I moved to the next stall, the vibration stronger, more insistent. It did not feel like machinery, it felt alive, but in a way I could not identify. There was nothing visible, nothing to explain the sensation. I checked the perimeter outside the building, looking for tracks or anything that could account for it. The sand was mostly smooth, disturbed only by wind patterns and scattered debris. No footprints, no tire marks. I spent over an hour circling the restroom and its immediate surroundings, trying to find any logical cause. I tapped on the walls, looked under the sinks, even checked the septic access points, but everything seemed in order. The vibrations seemed to follow me, subtle but unmistakable, like something moving beneath the concrete and sand. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise, and my pace slowed. There was a weight in the air, not oppressive but keenly noticeable, a sense of the unexpected underfoot. Eventually, I left the area, the vibration fading as I walked back to the truck. I ran the camera feed again, watching the heat signature disappear as soon as I crossed the threshold of the parking lot. It was gone, and I could not find any explanation. I marked the incident in the log and moved on to other parts of the park, the afternoon sun rising and casting long shadows across the desert floor. The next day, Another ranger was assigned to the same patrol. He told me what he had found in the restroom. The concrete stalls had deep claw marks etched into the interior walls, long grooves that could only have been made from the inside. The marks were jagged, uneven, and indicated a significant amount of force. Nothing had been taken, no trash disturbed beyond what the wind could account for. He said it looked like something had been trapped inside, trying to get out. I went back later that week to see the marks for myself. They were as fresh as he described, the concrete still rough in the grooves. I ran my hands along them, feeling the uneven edges. I measured the spacing and depth, trying to picture what could have caused them. The stall dimensions were standard, not large enough for a person to crouch and claw with that intensity without leaving other signs of struggle. I returned to the surrounding area, looking for tracks or disturbances. There was nothing else, no tracks, no discarded items, nothing to explain the vibrations I'd felt the day before. In retrospect, I thought about all the possibilities. Burrowing animals, seismic activity, structural shifts in the building, human pranksters. None of them fit. There were no known burrowing animals large enough to make vibrations that deep and precise under concrete. No earthquakes had been recorded. The building had been stable for decades, and the marks did not match human hands. I documented everything carefully, photographs, measurements, notes, but the mystery remained unresolved. I never felt the vibrations again, and the heat alerts never returned. I stayed away from that part of the park for weeks, giving the area a wide berth, though my curiosity gnawed at me. Every patrol, I would glance toward the abandoned restroom, half expecting to see movement or hear the subtle trembling beneath the ground. But the desert remained still, empty, and silent. The memory of that day stayed with me, a reminder that some things are real, tangible, and still impossible to explain. It was not fear from imagination. It was the unease of knowing that something had existed underfoot, had clawed from the inside, and had vanished without a trace. The incident was closed officially with a note about the unexplained marks and a recommendation for repair and monitoring. But in truth, I never stopped thinking about it. The park remained a place of sun and sand, of wind and quiet trails, but I always remembered the sensation of the vibration through the concrete, the warmth that had no form, and the evidence that something had been there, something determined enough to leave its mark and disappear without warning. August of 1992 was dry and bright in the mountains of western Montana. I was working a long patrol rotation with one partner, covering backcountry sections that most visitors never reached. The job was routine and slow. We checked trails, cleared fallen limbs, logged erosion, and watched for illegal camps. That week had a strange quiet to it. Fewer hikers than usual. The air felt thin and dusty. Sound carried farther. Every footstep seemed louder than it should have been. We were well past the posted park limits when we found signs that did not belong there. Cut branches stacked with care. Stones arranged to divert runoff. The work showed patience and skill. This was not a rushed camp. It sat in a fold of land between spruce and fir, tucked below a slope that broke the wind. Whoever built it understood drainage, shade, and concealment. It took time to notice it, even when we were close. The shelter itself was the most striking part. Logs were not hacked or split rough. They were shaped to fit, joints locked together without nails. Bark had been stripped clean and laid aside to form a roof layered with grass and soil. Smoke staining showed controlled fires burned low and clean. A trench diverted rain around the base. Everything about it suggested long use and deep knowledge of the land. The man was there when we arrived. He did not react with surprise or fear. He stood from a stool made of root wood and faced us like we were expected. His clothes were worn but mended with careful stitches. His boots were old but oiled and intact. His beard was trimmed short. His hands were clean. He looked fed and steady. He had no pack and no visible tools beyond a small blade at his belt. No trash lay around. No food wrappers. No bottles. Everything had a place. He claimed he had always been there. Not since last winter or a few years back. Always. The way he said it felt flat and practiced, like a statement rather than a belief. What unsettled me most was how much he already knew. He knew my name and my partner name before we spoke. He knew which day we covered that section and which day we did not. He knew when our radios went quiet due to terrain. He knew the truck stayed at the south turnout on this rotation. None of that information was public. It came from watching, listening, and patience. I felt exposed standing there. The woods around us no longer felt empty. They felt used. Not abused, but read and memorized. He had built himself into the land without leaving obvious marks. I realized then how little attention we paid to what lay beyond our maps. We documented what we could without provoking him. No identification was found. No permits. No signs of recent theft. No weapons that would justify immediate removal. Still, he was living far beyond the allowed boundary, and the skill of the shelter suggested long-term presence. We left with the intent to return the next morning with law enforcement and proper authority. That night, I slept poorly. I kept thinking about how long it must have taken to build that place. How many seasons passed while we walked routes nearby and never saw it? How often he watched us without being seen? The thought stayed heavy and close. We returned less than 24 hours later. Same route, same weather. The clearing where the shelter had been was empty. Not damaged, not burned, just gone. Logs were removed. Stones were scattered back into the stream bed. The trench was filled. Grass lay flattened in broad patterns as if weighted down and then lifted away. No clear footprints led out. No drag marks. No ash. The ground looked pressed by careful hands rather than trampled by haste. Law enforcement searched outward in widening circles. They found nothing. No trail. No cache. No sign of transport. It was as if the place had never existed. Only the flattened grass remained, already starting to rise. The explanation came slowly and without mystery. The man had studied us for years. He knew when patrols passed and when they did not. He likely copied names from reports, license plates, and gear tags. He could have listened to radio chatter from high ground. His shelter was designed to be dismantled. Each piece served more than one purpose. Logs doubled as carrying poles. Stones were native and easily returned. The grass roof could be lifted in sheets and laid flat to a raised shape. He left during the night or early morning when wind and dew softened traces. He did not vanish. He moved. He went deeper or farther or simply beyond our reach. The land allowed it because he treated it with care. The fear came not from the unknown, but from the realization that someone could live alongside us, observe us, and leave without a trace because they understood the terrain better than we did. The case closed with a simple note about an illegal inhabitant who relocated before removal. No follow-up was possible. I carried the memory with me long after that summer. It changed how I walked patrols. I looked at the ground more closely. I listened harder. I accepted that the wilderness holds people as well as animals, and some of them know how to disappear without breaking any laws of nature at all. April 2010 sat heavy in my memory because the river would not give anything back. The Mississippi River Basin had taken weeks of rain and snowmelt from far north and turned it into a wide moving sheet that swallowed banks, trees, and whole campgrounds. Evacuation orders had gone out early. Most people listened. Some did not. After the water peaked, our job was to move through the closed campsites and river access points and look for bodies. It was part search and part accounting. We were meant to confirm that nothing human was left behind before the public returned. There were 3 of us in the truck, 2 rangers with me. We had all worked floods before. We knew the smell of wet soil and fuel slicks and rot. We knew how a place looks after water sits on it too long. The river had pulled trash into branches and wrapped plastic bags around trunks like flags. Fire rings were buried under silt. Picnic tables leaned at bad angles. The ground felt hollow under our boots where the current had cut channels beneath the surface. Most campsites were empty in the expected way. Tents gone, coolers smashed or washed away. Sometimes a chair caught in brush. Sometimes a sleeping bag heavy with mud. The quiet was deep. Birds kept their distance. The sound of water filled every gap. We moved slowly and marked what we found, taking photos and notes, then moving on. By the third day, we started finding signs that did not fit evacuation timelines. Fire pits with fresh ash that still held shape. Food cans with labels bright and not yet scoured by water. Footprints pressed into soft ground that had settled after the flood crest. These were not old. People had come back or never left. It put weight on every step. It meant we might still find someone. One site sat lower than the rest, close to a bend where the current cut hard. The trees that were stripped clean on the riverside and thick with debris on the land side. The fire ring was intact and cold. A tarp lay folded under a log, weighted down with stones. There were small food wrappers tucked into the ring, as if someone tried to keep the place clean. That detail stayed with me. Order in a place that had no reason to be orderly. Near the waterline, where the ground dipped and turned slick, there were shoes. 3 pairs, small sizes, set side by side in a straight line. Toes pointed toward the river. The shoes were muddy, but not torn. They looked placed, not dropped. There were no tracks leading away from them. No drag marks. No signs of struggle. The water at that point was calm on the surface, but moved fast beneath, sliding past the bank with a quiet pull. We widened the search. We scanned the trees and brush. We checked downstream and upstream for clothing or packs. We marked the location and took photos from different angles. We noted the sizes and colors. We checked missing person reports when we returned to the truck later that day. There were none that matched. No children reported missing in the area. No families unaccounted for in the evacuation lists. It created a gap that had no easy shape. The ride back was silent. The road followed the river, and the water stayed level with the fields, pressing against levees, refusing to drop. The river looked full of intent. It carried logs and pieces of barns past us without pause. It felt like a living thing holding its breath. For weeks the water stayed high. We returned to that bend several times. Each visit stripped a little more from the bank. We found one shoe farther down, caught in reeds, crushed flat. We logged it. We found nothing else. The reports stayed empty. Life moved on for the towns along the river because it had to. Late that summer, a body surfaced miles downstream near a lock. It was small. The current had done what it always does. The remains were identified as a child through a medical exam and what little was left of clothing. There were no records that matched. No school records. No hospital birth. Nothing. A month later, another body surfaced farther south. Same age range. Same condition. No name. The explanation came together slowly, built from small facts and hard work. A seasonal labor camp had existed upriver for years, shifting locations to follow work. Families moved with it. Some people avoided records because records brought attention. During the evacuation, a few stayed back to protect what little they had. When the water rose faster than expected, some tried to cross at night to reach higher ground. The children were told to take off their shoes to keep them dry. The shoes were lined up by an older sibling who believed they would return. The river took them instead. No missing reports were filed because there was no trust in systems and no proof on paper that the children were there to begin with. The adults who survived moved on with the work and the season. Grief stayed private and uncounted. The river kept its habit of erasing edges and names. I still think about that line of shoes, the care in how they were set down, the belief behind the act. When the river finally dropped, the bank looked ordinary again. Grass grew back. Families returned to camp. Fires burned where ours once did. But every spring when the water rises, I remember April 2010 and the way the river stayed high, like it was holding something close, not out of malice, but because it does not know how to give back what it takes. I went up there because I wanted quiet and a place to think without people around. December always made me restless, and that year had been rough in ways I did not want to explain to anyone. I was working seasonal contracts and filling gaps with odd jobs. I had time off, a truck that ran, and a map with a dotted line that climbed into the mountains of central Idaho. The fire tower had been abandoned for years. No power lines went up the ridge. The radio had been removed long before I ever heard about it. That was part of the appeal. I wanted a place that felt cut off but still solid and real. The drive took most of the day. Snow sat in the shadows and turned to slush where the sun reached it. The road narrowed and grew rough. Pines closed in. The air felt dry and sharp. By the time I parked near the base of the ridge, daylight was already thinning. I hiked the last stretch with a pack and a flashlight, the beam catching frozen grass and rock. The tower came into view as a dark shape against a pale sky. It stood on steel legs bolted into concrete, the stairs open to the wind. The cab sat above the trees, windows clouded with age. Inside, the space was empty except for dust, a metal desk without drawers, a chair with torn vinyl, and a shelf bolted to the wall. The old radio mount was there, but the radio itself was gone. Cut cables hung like stiff cords. There was no generator, no battery bank, no solar panel. The place smelled of cold metal and old wood. Wind pushed through gaps and made the structure creak in a slow, steady way. I set my sleeping bag on the floor and ate from a can. I checked my phone, but had no signal. I turned it off to save the battery. Outside, the sky went black and clear. Stars showed through the windows, sharp and bright. The tower felt exposed but solid. The stairs hummed when the wind hit them. I lay there listening and thinking about nothing in particular. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to the sound of static. It came from behind me. It was not loud. It was steady, like a radio between stations. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. Then I sat up and turned my head. The sound was real. It was coming from the shelf area where the radio mount had been. At 2:14 a.m., the static stopped. A calm voice started speaking. It gave a weather report. Temperature, wind speed, wind direction, chance of snow before dawn. It mentioned the exact time. It mentioned conditions that matched what I felt through the walls. The voice was flat and clear. There was no emotion in it. The sound was not echoing. It was close, like a small speaker. My body locked up. I did not stand. I did not move toward it. I stayed where I was and listened until it ended. When the report finished, the static returned for a few seconds. Then there was a click. The sound stopped. I waited. I counted breaths. Nothing else happened. The tower kept creaking. Wind brushed the windows. My heart slowed. My hand shook. I searched the cab with my flashlight. I checked the shelf, the desk, the corners. I found a small gray box tucked behind a radio mount. It was about the size of a paperback book. A thin wire ran from it to a speaker screwed into the wall. Another wire ran down through a hole in the floor toward the stairs. The box had a label that was worn but still readable. It said weather receiver. It had a timer dial and a battery slot. The battery was still inside. It was old but not dead. I followed the wire down the stairs. Halfway down, tied to a beam, was a small antenna taped in place. It pointed toward the valley. I understood then. Someone had installed a simple weather receiver years ago. Maybe a ranger who wanted updates during storms. Maybe a maintenance worker. The main radio was gone, but this unit was separate. It did not need power from the tower. It ran on its own battery and picked up a nearby automated station. The timer was set to trigger at specific times. 2:14 a.m. was one of them. What bothered me was not that it existed. It was that it still worked. It had been left behind, forgotten, quietly doing its job long after the people were gone. The accuracy came from the system itself. Automated stations broadcast updates down to the minute. The voice was recorded. The timing was exact because that was how it was designed. Knowing that did not make me feel better. It made the place feel watched by a machine that did not care who was there. I imagined it clicking on every night, speaking into an empty room year after year. I removed the battery and put it in my pocket. The tower went silent again. I sat there until my hand stopped shaking. I did not lie back down. I packed my bag slowly and carefully. I did not rush, but I did not hesitate either. I climbed down the stairs with my light pointed at each step. The floors below felt thick and close. My truck sat where I left it, covered in frost. I unlocked it, climbed inside, and started the engine. The heater took a long time to warm up. I watched my breath fade as the cab filled with air. I slept in my truck that night. I parked facing downhill. I did not go back up to the tower. In the morning, I drove out early. The road looked the same. The trees stood quiet. Nothing followed me. Nothing needed to. Later, I looked up records for weather stations in that area. There was one in the valley, installed in the early 2000s. The broadcast schedule matched what I heard. The receiver model matched the box I found. Everything lined up. I never went back to that tower. I still think about that voice sometimes, speaking into the dark on a perfect schedule, not knowing or caring if anyone was listening. October in Wyoming has a way of turning the world cold and still. The mornings arrive with a thin fog that clings to the hillsides, and the low sun barely warms the air before it sinks again behind the ridges. I had been on a hunting patrol that year for the State Game Commission. It was early in the season, just after the rut, and our job was to check for poachers, illegal baiting, and any signs of disease in the herd. The mountains were quiet that week. The elk were moving in smaller groups, and the frost in the low meadows made the grass brittle and silver. My partners and I were moving through a narrow canyon when we saw it, a lone bull elk lying at the base of a rock outcrop. At first, I thought it had been shot and scavenged, but as we approached, the unease started to settle in. The elk was intact in terms of its hide. The coat was smooth, the antlers still sharp and heavy, but its body had been crushed inward. The chest and abdomen looked compressed, like something had pushed in on the animal evenly from all sides. There was no blood on the snow or the grass, not a drop. No signs of a struggle, no tracks other than the elk's own. The legs were bent at impossible angles, but not broken in the way a predator would leave them. The bones seemed compressed, almost fused. There was no bite mark, no claw scratches, nothing a scavenger or another animal would leave. The surrounding area was completely untouched, the grass pressed down in some spots as if the elk had simply settled there, but no signs of anyone or anything passing through. The first thought in my head was a bear, but I know bears. Bears leave tracks, they leave torn flesh. Coyotes or mountain lions would have taken pieces. There were no signs of predation anywhere. The silence of the canyon pressed in on us as we circled the elk. Even the older, more experienced rangers were quiet. One of them muttered that it looked compressed, a word that sounded almost wrong to say out loud, and we all felt the same hesitant disbelief. Nobody wrote that in the report. We filed the basics and moved on, but the image stuck in my head. The smell was faint, not the iron tang of blood, but a sour, almost chemical odor that hit the back of the throat when you leaned down to examine the elk. The eyes were open, cloudy, but fixed on the ridge above. The muscles around the shoulders and back were rigid, yet there was no tension in the limbs. I had seen hundreds of dead elk, but I had never seen one like this. The symmetry of the compression made it worse, because it was unnatural. There was a precision to it, a deliberate shaping of the body after death that made the stomach tighten in a way nothing else could. We documented the location, took photographs, and collected the GPS coordinates, but the rest of the team avoided touching the elk. The snow had started falling again, light and steady, each flake landing softly and melting before it could accumulate. The mountains were empty around us. No birds, no deer moving through the trees, just a quiet that seemed to weigh down on our shoulders. I walked around the elk again, noticing the subtle depressions in the soil, the faint impressions in the grass, trying to convince myself there had to be some explanation. None came. I spent hours thinking about what could do this. A natural collapse? Disease? Some unknown predator? None of the rangers had seen anything remotely like it. The local wildlife biologists were called in later, and they examined the elk at length. They found no trauma consistent with hunting, no disease that could have caused the collapse, no evidence of scavengers, no poison. The carcass was collected and studied, but even months later the report was inconclusive. The compressive damage was noted, but they avoided speculation in the final documentation. I returned to that area several times over the next few weeks, checking other valleys, following trails, but the elk was the only one. There were no signs that this had happened before or since. I found myself walking the ridges in silence, thinking about how still the forest was, how empty the air felt, how quickly the normal sounds of life had vanished that morning. I could not shake the image of the elk, The unnatural way the body had been compressed, and the absence of any explanation made every tree and rock feel heavier, more deliberate, as if the mountains themselves were watching. Eventually, I accepted that I would never know what had happened. The patrol reports stayed factual, the photographs archived, the GPS coordinates stored in a database. The experience left a quiet tension in my work, a reminder that some things exist in the world that do not make sense, that leave no trail, and demand only attention. I never encountered another carcass like that, but whenever I returned to the Wyoming canyons in October, I remembered the compressed elk, lying so still, so precise, and the eerie calm of a place that had swallowed the answer. The months passed, the patrols continued, and the forest healed itself, as it always does. The elk was gone, taken for study, and the snow melted, the grass returned. Yet the image remains, sharp and precise, as if the compression had etched itself into memory. I realized that the horror of that day was not in sight or sound, but in certainty. We could not explain it, we could not rationalize it, and that alone was enough to unsettle even the most seasoned among us. The mountains keep their secrets, and that elk, compressed and still, became one of them. May of 2001 was my first full spring as a ranger in the California foothills. The hills were already dry by then, grass pale and stiff, oaks throwing thin shadows across the ground. I was new, still learning routes and names, still trying to prove I belonged there. I volunteered for an extra patrol on a day that was already warm before noon. I wanted my name to stick. I wanted people to see that I worked hard and did not complain. I went alone. That was normal for short patrols. The map I carried showed a faint trail line that was marked but not labeled. It branched away from a fire road and climbed toward a set of low ridges. I assumed it was old and unused, but still public. There was no sign at the start. No tape. No barrier. Just a narrow break in the brush where boots had once passed often enough to leave a memory in the ground. The trail felt wrong almost right away. It was too quiet. No birds flushed when I stepped through. No insects rose from the dirt. The ground was packed hard in places, then soft and loose in others, like it had been walked recently and then left alone again. Manzanita leaned in close, branches scratching my sleeves. I remember thinking the air felt heavy, like it had weight to it. About halfway through, I smelled something that did not belong. It was not the sharp smell of scat or the sour smell of rot that comes from a body left too long in the sun. This was deeper and sweet in a way that made my throat tighten. I stopped walking and stood still until I could place it. The smell came from downhill to my right. I moved slowly off the trail, pushing branches aside with my forearm. The ground dipped into a shallow bowl, shaded by a cluster of oaks. That is where I saw the deer. It was a young buck, laid on its side. The body looked clean. No signs of struggle. No torn earth. The hide was intact except for a clean opening along the belly. The organs were gone. The cavity was empty and dry. There was no blood pooled in the dirt. The head was angled just right, legs tucked in close like it had been placed there. Flies hovered, but did not land much. There were no bite marks. No tracks around it, except my own once I realized I'd stepped too close. I knelt down and studied it longer than I should have. Scavengers should have torn it apart within hours. Coyotes were thick in that area. Birds would have gone for the eyes first. None of that had happened. The smell was strong but controlled, like something preserved just enough to slow nature down. I stood and backed away. My skin felt tight. I told myself it could be a poacher. Someone careful. Someone who knew how to work fast. Still, the way it was arranged bothered me. There was purpose in it, not haste. I returned to the trail and finished the patrol. I did not see anyone. I did not hear a vehicle. The rest of the walk felt longer than it should have. Every sound made me turn my head. When I reached the fire road again, the relief hit me hard enough to make my hands shake. I reported the carcass when I got back. I filled out the form with facts only. Location, condition, no speculation. I did not mention the trail itself. I assumed it was known. Later that week, an older ranger pulled me aside. He had been there for decades. His face carried the sun like a stain that never washed off. He asked why I had gone up that trail. The way he looked at me told me he already knew the answer was going to bother him. He explained that the trail had been closed since the late 70s. A seasonal worker had disappeared up there. Search teams found nothing. No gear, no remains, just a boot print that led into brush and never came out. After months, the trail was quietly dropped from use. Signs went missing. Maps were not updated. It was easier to let it fade. I had not told anyone I was going there. I had not signed it out. That part sat between us without words. He did not accuse me. He warned me. He said animals found like that showed up every few years along that route. Always clean, always untouched. He said enforcement never caught anyone. He said people who went up there alone usually only did it once. I did not sleep much that night. I kept seeing the deer in my head, the calm shape of it, the care taken. I thought about the smell and how it clung to my clothes even after I washed them. I thought about how quiet the birds had been. I never went back to that trail. I stopped taking extra patrols without telling anyone why. Over time, I learned that some places hold patterns you do not want to step into. Nothing supernatural happened to me. No figure followed me. No sound called my name. What stayed with me was the clear knowledge that someone had been there with intent and patience, far from roads, far from eyes, and comfortable enough to take their time. The foothills still look peaceful from a distance. People hike and camp and take photos. I still work outdoors. I still trust my training. But I also trust my instincts now. When something feels arranged, when nature does not behave as it should, I turn back. Some trails are not meant to be reopened, and some warnings only exist for those willing to notice them. It was late November of 1996, deep interior Alaska, the part of the map that looks empty even to people who live there. I was alone, running trapper permit checks before the real freeze locked everything down. Snow had been coming and going for weeks, never enough to settle, just enough to hide tracks and soften edges. The days were short, and the light stayed flat and gray. Sound carried far in that kind of cold. Even my own steps felt loud. I had a list of registered cabins and camps tied to active permits. The work was routine. Locate, verify condition, check posted numbers, log coordinates, move on. There were no roads anywhere near where I was that day. I had taken a snow machine as far as the river bend, then gone on foot. No trail, no cut brush, no flagging tape. That was normal. People liked privacy. Still, structures showed signs long before you reached them. Cut stumps, packed snow, trash burned spots. I saw none of that. The cabin appeared all at once through black spruce. It was set low, built tight, squared logs with clean notches. The roof held snow evenly, not drifted. Someone had swept it recently. The door faced east, away from prevailing wind. There was no smoke, but the stovepipe cap was clean. I stopped and listened. No sound except the trees ticking as they cooled. The permit list said nothing should be there. I circled wide, looking for tracks. Nothing fresh, nothing old. The snow near the door was brushed clean down to pack dirt and ice. I felt a wrongness settle in my chest. Not fear exactly, more like the feeling of stepping into a place where rules did not apply. I put my glove to the door latch and felt heat through the metal. I pulled back without opening it. The stove was warm. Not warm from the day before. Warm from hours ago. I checked the windows. They were plastic covered on the inside. Well fitted, no frost buildup. That meant recent heat. I entered because leaving without checking would have been worse. The door opened smooth. Inside smelled like dry wood and coffee grounds. The stove held a bed of coals, banked properly. A kettle sat on top, still warm to the touch. The cabin was clean. No clutter. No personal items. A table, 2 chairs, a cot, shelves with supplies. Everything was standard issue or surplus. Nothing handmade except the cabin itself. On the table was a binder. Clear cover, laminated pages inside. Ranger reports. My reports. The format was exact. Header, time, weather, location, notes. The first pages matched known patrols from years before. Same language. Same tone. No spelling errors. No embellishment. I flipped pages slowly. The dates moved forward. Winter of 1996, spring of 1997, summer entries that had not happened yet. They describe routine contacts, snow machine checks, permit verifications, equipment inspections. Then one page stopped me cold. My name appeared once, listed under field contact. It was not a narrative mention. It was a formal entry. Officer name, badge number, mine. The date was 3 months ahead. The report described a solo patrol in the same district. It listed weather conditions that matched long-range patterns. It noted a minor injury to my left hand from slipped axe. That detail was specific. I had injured that hand years earlier and favored it without thinking. The report ended with a note about an unregistered structure discovered and not logged due to jurisdictional uncertainty. I sat down without realizing it. My breath fogged the air, then faded as the stove continued its steady heat. I checked the rest of the binder. The later pages grew sparse. Fewer entries, shorter notes. Then they stopped. There were other things in the cabin that bothered me more as I noticed them. Extra rations rotated properly, fuel stored correctly, maps on the wall with patrol routes marked in pencil, including paths I had planned but not yet filed. A radio on the shelf, powered off, frequency set to our channel. The battery was warm. I searched for signs of who used the place. No clothing sizes that stood out. No photographs. No names. Everything was generic. Official. It felt like a place meant to exist without being noticed. I left before dark. I did not take anything. I did not mark the location. On the way back, I checked my bearings 3 times because the woods looked wrong, like I was being guided without knowing how. Back at the station days later, I pulled archived reports. The language matched mine exactly. Not copied, authored. I checked access logs. My files had been open on days I was in the field. The timestamps matched times when the radio showed weak signal gaps. In 1996, our system was not secure. Files moved on disks. Reports were typed on shared machines. I realized the only explanation that fit every detail without reaching for fantasy. Someone inside had been tracking me for years, reading my reports, studying my patterns, using my language, building a private outpost off the books to monitor ranger activity and predict it. The future dates were projections, not prophecy. The injury was an educated guess based on habits. The reason the cabin was never reported was because the report that would have logged it already said it would not be. I understood then why the stove was warm. Someone had left shortly before I arrived, confident I would not stay long, confident I would doubt myself. I never filed the cabin. Doing so would have forced questions I could not prove. The binder stayed there. The cabin stayed there, at least for a while. The future reports never happened exactly as written. I changed routes. I took partners. I left the service a few years later. I still think about the person who knew my work well enough to write it before I did. Not because of fear, but because of discipline. Whoever they were, they believed paperwork could shape reality if written early enough. And for a long time in that place, it almost did. July 2021 was dry for the Coast Range, the kind of dry that turns the understory brittle but keeps the canopy dark and cool. I had been with the agency long enough to know that summer there did not mean safety. It meant long hours, fewer people on the trails, and a steady list of small problems that could turn serious if ignored. That year, I was assigned a college intern for the season. He was studying forestry, already comfortable with maps and hand tools, already used to being wet and tired. He did not complain. He took notes. He watched how I moved through brush and how I checked my bearings without stopping. Our work was routine. Trail inspections, culvert checks, invasive plant surveys. One section of trail cut through a narrow drainage on the west slope. It was old logging land that had grown back thick. Alder and vine maple crowded the edges. Ferns filled the low spots. The trail itself dipped and climbed along a contour, never straight, always tight. Sound behaved strangely there. Sometimes footsteps vanished. Sometimes a bird wing sounded close enough to touch. On our 3rd week, we walked that segment late in the afternoon. The air was still. Fog had not pushed in yet, but the light was already flat. I remember thinking it was a good time to finish that section because it stayed cool even on hot days. We marked a washed-out tread and a leaning signpost. We moved slow, scanning for fresh slide scars. Nothing felt out of place to me. The next morning, the intern did not gear up. He sat at the table with his pack closed. He said he would not return to that trail segment. There was no edge in him, no attempt to sell a story. He said something had followed us silently for over an hour the day before. He said there were no branches snapping, no wind, just pressure like being watched from close range. He said it stayed just off to one side, never ahead, never behind, always near enough to feel. He said he had checked reflections in his phone screen and seen nothing but movement in the green. I listened. I weighed the usual explanations. Elk move quietly. Cougars can shadow a person without sound. People can misread their own nerves after long days. I did not see fear in him. I saw a firm decision. That afternoon, he turned in his badge and left the station. He packed his car and drove north. The next day, I learned he had left the state. I told myself it was stress, internships, and early sometimes. Still, his words stuck. Pressure was a strange choice. Not fear, not panic. Pressure suggested proximity. It suggested something managing distance with intent. I finished my other assignments and left that trail for later. A week passed. Weather stayed clear. I decided to walk it alone, not to prove anything, to close a loop in my own head. I carried standard gear, radio, first aid, map flagging. I started earlier than before. The trail looked the same. Ferns brushed my pants. The ground held my weight without noise. I noted prints that could have been deer. I smelled the sharp green of crushed leaves. As I entered the narrow drainage, the air cooled. Light thinned. Sound narrowed. My breathing felt loud. I slowed and then realized I had been slowing without choosing to. I corrected my pace and kept moving. I did not hear anything follow me. No footfall, no rustle. Still, the sense of being observed grew as the trail curved. It did not spike. It settled, like a hand placed between the shoulder blades. I focused on tasks. I checked the leaning signpost and marked it. I measured tread width and slope. I kept my eyes moving. The pressure stayed. It did not come from behind. It felt parallel. When the trail bent left, the pressure shifted left. When it bent right, it shifted right. I told myself this was awareness turned inward. I told myself the brain fills silence with patterns. I walked faster than I ever have on that terrain. Not running, just a steady push. I did not stop to drink. My calves burned on the short climbs. The pressure did not change. It matched me. At one point, I stepped off the trail to check a culvert inlet. The pressure paused. When I stepped back onto the tread, it returned. Halfway through the segment, I smelled something off. Not rot, not animals. A faint chemical bite that did not belong to the forest. It was gone as soon as I noticed it. My thoughts shifted then. Illegal grows were not rare in the range. People guarded them. They watched trails. They avoided sound. They tracked movement and kept distance. They knew how to stay downwind. I reached the far end of the segment, and the pressure lifted all at once. My shoulders dropped. My breath slowed. I stood there longer than needed and listened. I heard wind then. I heard a jay. I heard my own pulse settle. I reported my findings. Weeks later, law enforcement cleared a hidden camp upslope from the drainage. Not on the trail. Close enough to see it. They found irrigation lines tapped into a spring. They found trash buried shallow. They found footprints that crossed the trail in soft spots and then vanished into brush. Nothing supernatural had followed us. Something human had managed space with care. The intern felt it before I named it. He trusted that signal and left. I went back because it was my job. I walked faster because some part of me understood. I did not assign interns to that segment anymore. The forest there is quiet again, but quiet does not mean empty. My name is Daniel Ortiz. In March 2003, I was working night patrol alone in a remote stretch of northern New Mexico. The road cut through a narrow canyon where rock slides were common after winter storms. That week, a long section had been closed with cones and steel gates at both ends. No traffic was allowed through. My job was to drive it anyway check for new slides, check the sensors, and log anything that could block emergency access. The motion sensors were old pressure units buried under the asphalt near known slide zones. They were set to trigger when weight crossed them. Usually that meant a vehicle that ignored the closure or a large animal like an elk. That night, the alert light on my dash kept coming on. Every time I checked the location, there was nothing there. No tire tracks, no animals. The dirt shoulders were smooth and cold. The wind was light. I reset the system twice and kept moving. The canyon felt closed in after dark. The rock walls rose straight up on both sides. My headlights caught dust hanging in the air from earlier slides. The smell of wet stone and oil stayed inside the cab. I drove slow because the road surface was uneven from debris that had been cleared earlier in the week. Every few minutes, the sensor light blinked again. It did not stay on long enough to record a weight value. Just a brief trigger. Around 2 in the morning, I was heading uphill toward the west gate. The road curved left and narrowed. As my headlights swept across the bend, I saw a tall shape crossing the road from right to left. It moved slow, too slow to be an animal. It did not reflect light. No eyes, no shine. It looked narrow and upright. The height was wrong for a deer. The pace was steady and calm. I hit the brakes and rolled to a stop. The shape was already off the road by the time I stopped. The shoulder there dropped in a loose rock and scrub. I kept the lights aimed where it had gone. There was nothing, no movement, no sound. I waited. The canyon stayed quiet except for the engine. I got out with a flashlight and checked the area. The ground was rocky and uneven. Footprints were hard to see. I found scuffed gravel near the edge of the asphalt. It could have been anything. Wind, a small slide. I did not see any animals. I did not see a person. The idea of someone walking through a closed slide zone at night did not make sense, but nothing else fit either. I got back in the truck and continued. The sensor light came on again within minutes. Same thing. Brief trigger. No record. I started to feel watched, not in a dramatic way, but in the way you feel when you know something is wrong and you cannot name it. I stayed focused on the road. When I reached the west gate, I turned around and headed back down. Halfway through the canyon, I felt a faint vibration under my feet. A soft tapping sound came through the hood. It was not loud. It was steady. It sounded like something touching metal from underneath. I stopped and listened. The tapping continued while the engine idled. When I shut the engine off, it stopped. I popped the hood and checked with a light. Nothing obvious. No loose cables. No leaks. The skid plate under the engine looked intact from what I could see. I closed the hood and started the engine again. The tapping came back. It was slower now, like something shifting with the vibration. I finished the patrol and headed back to the station before dawn. I reviewed the dash cam footage later that morning. The video showed the road clearly. When the headlights swept the curve, there was nothing crossing. No shadow, no shape. The exposure adjusted like normal. The timestamp matched exactly when I remembered stopping. The audio was different. You could hear the engine idling. You could hear wind. And under that there was a tapping sound. It was hollow and metallic. It came from beneath the hood area. It was not rhythmic like engine knock. It was irregular, like something being nudged. I went back out in daylight with a mechanic from the yard. We put the truck on a lift. A fist-sized rock was wedged between the skid plate and the frame rail. It had scraped fresh metal. There were smaller stones packed around it. The mechanic said it could have bounced up during a slide and lodged there. When the engine vibrated, the rock shifted and tapped. We also walked the road again. Near the curve where I saw the shape, we found a strip of dark fabric caught on a bush below the shoulder. It was matte and heavy, like a poncho or tarp. There were shallow footprints leading off toward a dry wash. They were spaced far apart, like someone taking slow, careful steps downhill. The prints faded where the ground turned to rock. The motion sensors were explained too. Overnight temperature changes caused the asphalt to contract. Small slides shifted weight just enough to trigger them without leaving clear signs. The brief alerts matched that pattern. Nothing supernatural happened to me that night. No creature followed me. No voice spoke. What stayed with me was the fact that someone had been there. A person moving through a closed canyon in the dark, wearing something that did not reflect light, crossing the road without urgency. The dash cam did not catch them because they were outside the beam for less than a second and the camera adjusted exposure too slowly. The sound that bothered me had a simple cause. I filed the report. Maintenance cleared the road a week later. The fabric was logged and turned over. I never learned who it belonged to. I never saw anyone out there again. Every explanation fit. That made it worse, not better. It meant that everything I saw and heard had a real cause, and that cause had been close to me in a place where I thought I was alone. June of 2018 stays fixed in my head because of how normal it began. Warm air, wet soil, the smell of leaf rut that never fully leaves the Appalachians. I was part of a 4-person search team called in for a missing solo hiker. Middle-aged, experienced, familiar with the area, the kind of person who left clean itineraries and carried paper maps. He had signed out properly and failed to return. That alone put weight on the call. We parked at the trailhead before sunrise. The woods were quiet in that early way where birds wait for light. The trail was packed dirt with rock ribs showing through, cut into a slope that had been walked for decades. We moved slow and wide, eyes down, spacing tight enough to keep sight lines. I remember thinking the forest felt close even then, thick with young growth and low branches. We found his pack less than a mile in. It sat at the base of a poplar, leaned upright like it had been placed there. His boots were lined up beside it, toes pointing toward the trail, laces tucked in. Nothing was torn. No blood. No signs of a struggle. Inside the pack was food, water, spare socks, a light jacket, and his map. He had not been forced to leave it. He had chosen to. That choice mattered. People do not abandon boots without a reason. We marked the spot and began tracking. The soil held prints well from recent rain. His socks had left faint outlines at first, then bare feet. The prints pointed uphill, off the trail, into briars and loose rock. That alone raised concern. Experienced hikers avoid that unless there's a problem. For the first stretch, his stride looked normal. Careful placement, heel to toe, weight balanced. Then something changed. The stride length doubled. The prints grew lighter. He was moving fast, running, uphill, through thorn and stone. No one does that without fear or panic. There were scrapes on saplings where skin had brushed past. Drops of blood from thorn cuts, not enough to slow him. We followed for nearly a mile. The terrain steepened. The forest closed in. Rhododendron choked the slope and hid gaps in the ground. His prints cut straight up, ignoring switchbacks, ignoring ease. The pace stayed fast. At one point his steps veered hard left, then corrected. That told me he had slipped or stumbled and recovered without stopping. Near a rock outcrop, the prints faltered. The soil thinned and stone took over. We lost the track there and began a grid search. That area was known for shallow caves and sinkholes masked by leaves. Water ran under the ground, cold and fast, feeding creeks lower down. We spread out, careful, calling silently through hand signals and movement. We found a place where the ground had collapsed inward, not fresh, but open enough to swallow a person. The edges were scuffed. Leaves were disturbed. Inside, the walls dropped steep and wet. There were scrape marks on the rock where someone had slid. At the bottom, water flowed through a narrow channel, too tight to follow far without gear. There were no remains, but the signs lined up. The boots made sense then. Crossing water barefoot is common to keep boots dry. He may have planned to step through a shallow stream nearby, but there was no stream where the pack lay. The nearest water was downhill, not up. That meant he did not remove the boots for comfort. He removed them for speed. Bare feet grip better on wet stone. He was trying to move fast. What caused that fear stayed unclear at first. There were no signs of animal attack. No large prints. No scat. No broken brush that suggested a chase. But there were hog tracks farther down the slope, fresh and many. Feral hogs run in groups and will bluff charge. A sudden sound, a rush through brush, can trigger a flight response even in seasoned hikers. Panic strips away logic. The pattern fit. A hog encounter near the trail. He drops his pack to lighten weight. He pulls off boots for traction. He runs uphill, away from the sound, through the thickest cover. Adrenaline stretches his stride and lifts his steps. He reaches rock, slips, slides into a hidden opening, and is carried by underground water where recovery is unlikely. We searched for days. Dogs worked the area. Rope teams checked every hole we could access. Nothing came back. The official conclusion listed accidental fall, following a flight response triggered by wildlife. It was clean on paper. It made sense. What stayed with me was not the paperwork. It was the feeling after. The woods felt altered. Not hostile, just closer. Branches seemed to crowd the path. Sounds felt nearer than they should. I knew it was my mind filling gaps, replaying tracks and choices, but it lingered. Every time I stepped uphill after that, I watched my pace. I watched where fear could take me. We never found him because the land kept him. The Appalachians are old and full of quiet traps that do not look dangerous until you are already moving too fast to stop. I learned that day how thin the line is between skill and instinct, and how quickly the forest reminds you that it does not need to chase you. It only needs you to run once. October of 1987 was already wet in the Cascades. I took the assignment because I needed the hours and because nobody else wanted it. The lookout sat on a ridgeline that had not been staffed in years. My job was to secure it before snow made the access trail unusable. Lock the cap, inventory what was left, remove anything that could be stolen or damaged by weather. Leave the key with the district office when I was done. I hiked in alone with a pack that felt heavier than it should have. The trail was narrow and soft with rot. Ferns bent over my boots and left cold water on my socks. The trees were tall and close together, mostly fir and cedar, dark even in the middle of the day. There was no wind, just a low, steady drip from the canopy. I could smell wet needles and old earth the entire climb. The lookout came into view late in the afternoon. It stood on a set of wooden legs anchored into stone. The stairs were gray and split, each step bowed in the middle. I tested everyone with my weight before committing. A few shifted under me and groaned. I kept my eyes on the grain of the wood, not the drop beneath it. The cab door stuck when I tried to open it. I leaned my shoulder into it and felt it give. Inside, the air was stale and damp. It smelled like soaked wood, mouse droppings, and rust. The windows were filmed with dirt. One pane had a long crack that had been taped from the inside at some point, the tape yellow and dry. There was a desk bolted to the floor with a chair that had lost most of its padding. A metal cot sat against one wall. The mattress was bare and stained. In the corner was a small stove with a pipe that ran up through the roof. Everything felt abandoned, but not ancient. Someone had been there long after the lookout was supposed to be closed. I began the checklist. I wrote down the condition of the stairs, the windows, the roof. I noted evidence of rodents. I swept the floor with a broom that shed more bristles than it moved dirt. As I worked, I kept thinking about how the place held sound. Every movement echoed. When I stopped, the silence felt thick. On the desk sat a logbook. It was wrapped in a plastic bag that had gone cloudy with age. I assumed it was a relic left behind, something from the early days of the tower. I opened it out of habit. The first pages were what I expected. Names from the 50s and 60s. Notes about smoke on the horizon. Weather records. Neat handwriting that changed with each season. As I flipped forward, the dates kept going. 73, 78, 81. The writing settled into one style. Tight letters. Even spacing. Short entries. The ink dark and consistent. The last page was dated September 1987. Less than a month before I stood there. The entries near the end were not about fires. They talked about watching the tree line breathe at dusk, about counting steps around the cab at night, about not sleeping much, about sounds on the stairs that did not match animals. The handwriting stayed steady. No signs of panic in the letters themselves, just the content shifting away from the job. I read the final entry twice. It was dated the day before my assignment began. It described preparing the place for someone else, locking things back where they belonged, leaving the book where it could be found. There was no name at the end, just a date and a full stop. I closed the book and sat still. I felt exposed inside the cab like the windows were eyes. I checked the stairs again from above. There were no fresh breaks. No signs of recent repairs. The trail below showed no clear footprints, just the same churned mud I had walked through. I finished the work as daylight faded. I sealed the windows as best I could. I latched the door. I carried the logbook outside and stood on the platform with it in my hands. The forest below was turning black. The tree tops moved slightly as the air cooled, a slow sway that could look like breathing if someone watched long enough. I left the book on the desk. I locked the door. I walked down the stairs one step at a time and did not look back. I hiked out before dark, faster than I should have on that trail, my legs burning by the time I reached my truck. I did not mention the logbook to my supervisor. I told him the stairs were unsafe and the cab should stay closed. I left the key on his desk without explanation. He did not ask. Months later, after winter passed, I learned what had happened. The lookout had been unofficially used by a former seasonal worker who never fully left the job. He lived nearby, off the grid, moving between old service structures when he could. He kept watch because it gave him purpose. He avoided contact and signed no paperwork. When the district finally scheduled a full closure, he wrote his last entries and moved on. There was nothing supernatural about the book. It was a record of isolation and routine breaking down, of a man alone long enough to notice things too closely and assign meaning where there was none. The breathing tree line was just wind and shadow. The counted steps were his own pacing. The sounds were animals and wood settling in the cold. Knowing that did not make the memory easier. I still remember the smell of that cab and the way the silence pressed in. I remember holding the key and choosing to leave it where someone else could decide what to do. The lookout stayed closed after that. The stairs were removed. The cab was taken down piece by piece. The ridge went quiet again, and whatever need had drawn someone to watch it faded with the structure itself. August 2009 sits in my memory with a weight that never left. I was assigned to verify a report from hikers about a washed-out trail in southern Utah. The canyon did not appear on current maps because erosion had made it unstable. It had been removed years earlier after a flash flood collapsed several narrow sections. Officially, we were not supposed to go past the first drop where the trail broke apart and slid into the wash. The plan was simple. Walk in far enough to confirm damage, mark it as impassable, then leave. I went out with 2 volunteers who had signed up for trail assessment work. They were fit and experienced, and I trusted them. The drive out took hours through empty land where the rock felt stripped down to bone. By the time we parked, the heat had already pressed into everything. The canyon mouth looked quiet and clean, the kind of place that feels empty even when it is not. We entered early in the morning. The first drop was worse than reported. The trail had fallen away in long slabs, leaving loose gravel and exposed roots. Past that point, the canyon narrowed fast. The walls rose straight up, pale stone with dark streaks where water once ran. Within minutes, the radios went silent. I tried to check in and got nothing but static. That was expected. We had known signal would drop, but being inside it felt different. The air felt trapped. Sound did not behave the way it should. Our footsteps came back to us late, soft echoes that arrived a second after each step. Sometimes they came from behind us, sometimes from the side. It made it hard to tell where anyone was without looking. Even breathing sounded wrong. It carried farther than it should have, then disappeared. We moved deeper than planned because the canyon bent in a way that hid distance. The light thinned as the walls closed. Sand covered the floor, smooth in places, rippled in others. There were no tracks. That stood out. Not animal prints, not boot marks, nothing. It looked brushed clean. About an hour in, we found the first fire ring. It sat against the canyon wall, built from flat stones stacked with care. The stones were darkened by heat, but not old. The ash inside was pale and fine. No trash, no cans, no foil, no melted plastic. People who camp illegally always leave something behind. This had nothing. We kept moving, uneasy but focused on the task. Then we found another ring, then another. They were spaced far apart, deeper than anyone should bother going. Each one was neat, almost careful. None had footprints around them. The sand remained smooth. As we walked, the sense of being accompanied grew stronger. I did not hear steps. What I noticed was breathing. It came in slow pulls that did not match my own. It stayed just outside the rhythm of our movement. When we stopped, it faded. When we moved, it returned. I told myself it was my own breath bouncing strangely off stone, but it did not line up. The canyon narrowed again until the walls nearly touched. Light turned gray. The temperature dropped. We reached the point where we were supposed to stop, but the damage ahead was visible and severe. The trail beyond had collapsed entirely into a steep drop filled with debris. There was no need to go farther. I marked the location and turned us back. On the way out, the breathing followed us. It felt closer. Still no footsteps. No sound of fabric or gravel shifting. Just air moving through lungs. I kept checking behind us. The canyon curved too tightly to see far. Every bend felt like it held something just out of sight. The volunteers stayed quiet. Their posture changed. They walked closer together. I could feel their tension even without looking. When the canyon began to open and light returned, the pressure eased a little. The air warmed. The echoes softened. We stepped back into full sun near the mouth. Radios came back to life all at once with bursts of noise. The world felt normal again, louder and wider. We took off our packs and drank water. One of the volunteers looked at me and asked why someone had been following us the whole time. I did not answer. I could not explain what I had noticed without sounding unsure. I asked what they meant. The volunteer said they heard breathing behind us the entire way in and out, always the same distance back. They thought it was me or the other volunteer until they realized it did not match our pace. That confirmed what I had been trying to dismiss. I had heard the same thing, but never saw anyone. There were no tracks, no signs of someone moving through sand. The fire rings told a story, though. Someone had been living there or spending time there, careful enough to leave nothing behind and skilled enough to move without marking the ground. Flash floods reshape canyons. They also erase evidence. I filed a report with full details. I marked the canyon as unsafe due to erosion and unauthorized human presence. The trail was closed completely. Later, I learned from a colleague that law enforcement had quietly investigated the area months earlier after a missing person report tied to a seasonal worker who drifted through remote desert sites. They never found him. I never returned to that canyon. It stayed off the maps. Over time, more sections collapsed, sealing parts of it entirely. I still think about the way sound behaved in that place and how easy it would be for someone to remain unseen there. The breathing had not felt threatening. It felt patient, like someone used to watching people pass through without being noticed. February of 2014 was my 8th month on the job. I was still learning which forms mattered and which ones no one read. I was the lowest ranking ranger on the roster that week, which meant I got the work no one else wanted. A timber company had called in a complaint about boundary signage being off by a few yards. Winter storms had rolled through hard and steady, and several markers had likely gone down. I was sent alone into a state forest in northern Minnesota to walk the line and recheck every post. The temperature stayed near -12 degrees Fahrenheit all day. The sky was flat and gray, the kind of light that makes distance hard to judge. Snow was chest deep in places where it drifted between trees. I wore a pack with flagging tape, a GPS unit, extra gloves, and a thermos that went cold within an hour. Every breath burned. My eyelashes froze together whenever I blinked too slow. The quiet was the first thing I noticed. No wind moved the branches. No birds crossed the canopy. The trees did not creak or pop. The snow absorbed everything. Each step made a dull thump that felt too loud in my head. I stayed on the boundary line, using old blazes on trunks and a bearing off the GPS. There was no trail, just forest that had not been logged in decades. About 2 hours in, I noticed boot prints ahead of me. They were not fresh. Snow had softened their edges and filled them halfway. They were spaced evenly, careful, and they followed the boundary line with precision. Marker to marker, turn for turn. Whoever made them knew exactly where the line ran, even through dense spruce where visibility dropped to a few yards. At first, I assumed another ranger had been sent earlier and not logged it. That bothered me, but did not scare me. What bothered me more was the type of print. They were deep, narrow, and consistent. No snowshoe marks, no drag from gear, just boots moving with purpose through snow that should have slowed anyone down. I followed them because they went where I needed to go. The deeper the forest got, the quieter it became. My ears rang from the lack of sound. I checked marker after marker, resetting a few that had tilted or fallen. The print stayed ahead of me, always a little farther than I expected. Then the forest opened into a clearing. It was a wide bowl-shaped space, maybe 50 yards across, ringed by young aspen and brush buried under snow. Wind had scoured the center flat. The boot prints led straight into the clearing. They crossed the open snow and stopped dead in the middle. No turn, no stumble, no marks leading away. Just two final impressions side by side, half filled with snow, as if the person had stood there and then vanished. I walked slow around the area, careful not to step on the prints. I searched for signs of fall, a jump, anything. There were none. No branches bent. No disturbed snow beyond that point. The clearing felt wrong. Not threatening, just empty in a way that pressed on my chest. I checked my GPS and compass again. Everything matched. The boundary marker on the far side stood upright, untouched. I felt exposed standing there. I cannot explain why. I told myself it was the cold and the quiet playing tricks on me. I stepped to the edge of the clearing to continue my work and nearly went down to my waist in snow. That was when I saw it. A narrow line ran across the clearing, almost invisible. It was a snow-covered logging road packed hard beneath drifts. It crossed the clearing at an angle. The surface was level and firm, hidden by a smooth layer of wind-blown snow. From above, it blended perfectly with the surrounding ground. The boot prints ended exactly where the packed road passed under the drift. I knelt and brushed away snow with my glove. The surface underneath was solid ice and frozen dirt. On the far side of the road, the snow was shallow, blown clean by wind. There were faint scuffs there, barely visible, leading in a brush that curved out of sight. The person had stepped off the soft snow onto the hard road, then walked away where the snow did not hold a print. The reason I had not seen tracks leaving was because the ground there could not take them. Relief came first, then something colder followed it. The prints had followed the boundary with accuracy that matched survey maps, not ranger markers. The hidden road was not on my map. Timber companies used roads like that to push lines quietly, to test how far they could go before someone noticed. I finished resetting the last marker and took photos of the road and the prints. On the hike back, I found more signs once I knew what to look for. Flagging cut and removed. Trees blazed fresh and covered with snow. Someone had been checking the line before me, measuring, planning. I filed a full report that night. The timber company was investigated and fined for encroachment. The road was added to official maps and blocked the following spring. I went back to that clearing once, months later, when the snow was gone. The road was obvious then, rutted and old, hidden only by winter. Standing there in daylight, it all made sense. But I never forgot how it felt to stand in that clearing, staring at footprints that seemed to end in nothing, in a forest so quiet it felt like it was holding its breath. It was early October, and the leaves in the forest had turned a deep, rich orange and red, the kind of colors that make you pause for a moment and just take them in. I had been assigned to a remote section of the forest in northern Idaho, an area that wasn't heavily trafficked by hikers, mostly just old logging trails and some narrow dirt roads that had long ago been abandoned. My job that week was routine patrol and trail maintenance, but the remoteness of the area always carried a quiet tension that I never quite got used to, even after 5 years on the job. The roads were narrow and rocky, with steep drop-offs in some places, and cell service was non-existent. I liked the quiet most of the time, but it could also make you hyper-aware of every sound. The wind rustling the trees, a distant snap of a branch, the far-off call of a hawk. I started the day around 7 a.m., checking the ranger station, filling out my patrol logs, and making sure the truck was stocked with fuel, water, and basic first aid supplies. I knew that in this area, getting help could take hours if something went wrong. so preparation was everything. The old fire tower near the center of my patrol area had been decommissioned years before. The radio had been removed long ago, the generator long since silent. It was mostly just a wooden tower now, with peeling paint and rusty railings, leaning slightly as if it were tired of holding itself up. Still, it provided the best view of the surrounding forest and hills. I spent the morning checking the main trails, removing fallen branches, filling erosion ruts with gravel, and marking some areas where the trail edges had started to collapse. Around noon, I stopped for a quick lunch on a small outcrop overlooking a creek. The sunlight was golden through the canopy, and the air smelled like pine and wet leaves. I stayed there for a while, taking notes in my patrol log about the condition of the trails, water crossings, and areas that would need more maintenance later in the season. After lunch, I headed toward the fire tower. The trail to it was steep and rocky, winding through a dense section of forest where the sun barely reached the ground. I had done this hike dozens of times, so I knew every switchback and loose stone. While I reached the tower in the late afternoon, I climbed the narrow stairs to the observation platform. The view was breathtaking. You could see miles of forest stretching out, a mix of conifers and hardwoods, with small clearings where wildlife might gather. As I was taking photographs for the park records, I noticed something odd. The radio equipment that should have been long gone. I could see the empty shelf and missing wires suddenly had a faint static in the corner. I froze, listening. The static grew louder for a few seconds, and then, unexpectedly, a voice came through, calm, professional, reading a weather update. It was accurate down to the minute, mentioning the current temperature, wind direction, and a forecast for the next few hours. I checked my watch. It matched perfectly. My first thought was that maybe someone had installed a hidden automated transmitter, but there was no way it could be this remote, and I was the only person in the area that day. I stepped back from the edge of the platform, my heart racing slightly. The static faded slowly, leaving only the natural sounds of the forest. I spent some time trying to make sense of it. The tower was old, disconnected from power, and I had confirmed months ago that the main radio system in this section of the forest was offline. There was no signal, no repeater nearby. It was a strange experience, unsettling in a way I couldn't quite explain, but I didn't let it interfere with my work. By the time I started heading back down, the sun was beginning to set. The shadows in the forest stretched long, and the temperature dropped quickly. I kept my flashlight ready, the beam cutting through the darkening trees as I navigated the narrow trail back to my truck. I noticed small animal tracks along the path, deer, a coyote, maybe a bobcat, but nothing alarming. The forest seemed to settle back into its usual quiet rhythm, the wind whispering through the branches. I made it to my truck just after dusk. The sky was a deep indigo, stars beginning to appear between the treetops. I sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes, taking off my pack and drinking water, letting my muscles relax after the climb. I thought about the radio, still puzzled, but I told myself that some mysteries didn't need immediate answers. My priority was safety and reporting what I observed. I recorded the incident in my patrol notes, noting the time, location, and what had happened. It was unusual, yes, but it wasn't dangerous. That night, I slept in the back of my truck near the trailhead. The engine off, windows cracked slightly for air. The forest around me was dark and silent, except for the distant sound of running water from a nearby creek and the occasional rustle of leaves. I felt safe, strangely calm despite the earlier event. The next morning, I continued my patrol, finishing the maintenance tasks and heading back to the ranger station. The radio never made a sound again, and I never figured out what caused it. Looking back on that night, I realized it didn't matter if it was a malfunction, interference, or something else entirely. I stayed focused, followed procedures, and kept myself safe. That's what matters as a park ranger. Preparation, awareness, and calm in the face of the unexpected. It was a long day in the forest, but I completed my duties, returned to the station without incident, and documented everything. The forest had tested my attention and focus in a quiet, strange way, but I left knowing I had handled it responsibly, exactly as a ranger should. I was working a late-season patrol in the northern Idaho backcountry in early November of 2011. The forest was already deep into fall, with the first dustings of snow on the ground and the mornings cold enough to frost over the inside of my water bottle. My assignment that week was to check on a series of old logging roads and trails that hadn't been used much in years, making sure that the gates were secure, that there were no illegal off-road vehicles tearing up the forest, and that hikers and hunters were following the rules. The office had sent me out solo because it was a quiet week. Most of the seasonal crews had already gone home for the year. I didn't mind. I liked the solitude. It let me move at my own pace and notice things most people missed. I started early, around 6 in the morning, driving my truck up one of the old access roads that wound between dense stands of lodgepole pine and aspen. The road was narrow and bumpy, covered with a thin layer of frost that made traction tricky in spots. I moved slowly, listening to the tires crunch and grind over frozen leaves and loose gravel. I had my binoculars on the dash, a notebook in the passenger seat, and my camera in my coat pocket. My plan was to hike a short loop on a trail that branched off the road, check on a couple of abandoned cabins that had been logged in years ago, and then finish by checking the gates back down near the highway. The first few hours passed without incident. The air was crisp, and the sun had just broken through the fog that hung low in the valley. I stopped a few times to note signs of wildlife, deer tracks, the faint trail of a coyote, and some squirrel nests tucked into the lower branches of the pines. One cabin I passed was little more than a collapsed frame with a rusted stove leaning in the corner. I photographed the roof beams that had fallen inward and scribbled a note about its coordinates and condition. Everything felt normal, the kind of quiet I was used to in the forest, where the only sounds were birds, wind in the trees, and the occasional creak of an old log under my boots. By late afternoon, I reached the far end of the road near a small creek that curved through the valley. I parked and decided to hike along the creek to see how the water levels were after the recent rains. The forest narrowed here, and the undergrowth was thicker. Fallen trees blocked parts of the trail, and I had to duck and step over branches. The light was fading faster than I expected. I carried a flashlight in my pack, but I liked to hike while there was still some daylight, so I could make mental notes about the terrain and obstacles. About an hour into the stretch, I noticed something unusual. There was a faint trail of disturbed earth along the bank of the creek, almost like someone had dragged something heavy through the mud. At first, I thought it might be an old logging sled or even evidence of illegal hunting. The tracks weren't human. They were wider, almost like something with hooves, but irregular, as if the animal had slipped or struggled. I crouched and examined them. They led toward a thicket of alder and young spruce, then vanished into the shadows. I made a note in my book, photographing them carefully with my flashlight. The forest was growing darker, and I knew I needed to start heading back to the truck. I followed the trail in the general direction I had come, but after 20 minutes I realized I had misjudged the turns in the creek and was further upstream than I thought. My GPS signal was spotty under the dense canopy, so I relied on my compass and my memory of the terrain. The creek bent in several sharp turns, and the undergrowth was dense enough that I had to push branches aside constantly. I had been walking in silence, hearing only the sound of water and the occasional snapping twig underfoot, when I noticed a large fallen tree spanning the creek ahead. It was thick, moss-covered, and slippery. I carefully tested each step before crossing, leaning on my walking stick. About halfway across, I heard a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl but muffled by the trees. My heart jumped. I froze and scanned the area with my flashlight. Nothing moved. The sound came again, quieter, closer. It wasn't a coyote or a wolf. I had been trained to recognize their calls, and this was deeper, heavier. I realized there could be a large elk or moose nearby, maybe startled by me. I stayed calm, kept my flashlight on the ground near my feet, and moved slowly across the log. The animal, if it was one, didn't appear again. Once across, I regained the trail and decided to take a wider, more familiar path back toward the road. The sun had fully set, and I relied on my headlamp to navigate. It was easy to lose the trail in this section. The undergrowth was thick, and fallen trees crisscrossed the path. About 30 minutes later, I finally saw the faint glow of my truck's headlights through the trees. Relief washed over me. I moved faster, eager to get back to warmth and radio contact. I reached the truck and unlocked it, shaking off branches and brushing mud from my boots. I started the engine, the heater kicking in immediately, and sat for a moment, listening to the quiet hum. I thought about the tracks I had seen and the sound I had heard. Whatever it was, it hadn't followed me, and the forest had returned to its usual calm. I documented everything in my notebook, took photos, and made a full report for the office. I drove back down the gravel road, careful of the frost patches, and locked the gates behind me. By the time I returned to the ranger station, it was nearly 10 p.m. I went through my notes, typed up the report, and filed the photos. The next morning, I returned to the same area with a small crew to investigate the tracks. They turned out to be from a large elk that had likely been injured or tangled in the undergrowth, dragging itself through the mud. The sound I had heard was probably it struggling across the fallen trees. No one had been in danger. The experience stuck with me, not because it was terrifying in the usual sense, but because it reminded me how easily you can feel isolated and unsure in the forest, even when you are experienced. It reinforced the importance of preparation, observation, and respect for the wilderness. From that point on, I carried extra equipment, stayed closer to known trails at night, and documented everything carefully. The forest hadn't been dangerous, just unpredictable. And that, in the end, is exactly why I love being a park ranger. I had been a park ranger in central Idaho for nearly 6 years by the winter of 2007. That December, the snow came early and heavy, covering the pine forests in thick, silent blankets. I was assigned to a remote section of the Sawtooth National Forest, a stretch of trail that wound up into high ridges, passing old mining claims and abandoned logging camps. It was one of the loneliest posts in the region, and in winter it became nearly unreachable without a snowcat or snowshoes. Most of the time I patrolled alone, checking on trail markers, inspecting old fire lookouts, and ensuring that no one had become trapped by early storms. One morning, just before sunrise, I loaded my truck with supplies and headed out along the snow-covered access road. My goal was an old fire tower built in the 1930s, long since decommissioned. It had no power. The radio had been removed years before, and the only thing left were the tower itself and a small cabin at the base. My plan was to inspect the structure, make sure it wasn't leaning dangerously, check for loose boards, and clear the snow from the stairs. The last storm had left several feet of powder. I didn't want anyone trying to use it in spring to get hurt. The drive took over an hour. Snow had drifted across the road in deep ridges, forcing me to weave carefully between the high banks. The sky was pale, and the sunlight struggled through low clouds. When I reached the clearing where the tower stood, the silence hit me like a physical thing. There was no wind, no animals, no birds calling. The snow around the tower was unbroken except for a set of animal tracks, probably a fox or a coyote, sliding across the drifts in quick, measured steps. I parked my truck and spent a few minutes surveying the structure. The metal ladder up the side of the tower was icy but intact. The cabin at the base was mostly buried in snow, with icicles hanging from the eaves. I started by digging a path to the tower's stairs. Each step was heavy with snow, and the cold made my gloves stiff. As I climbed, I ran my hands over the metal supports, checking for rust or cracks. Everything seemed solid, though the paint had long since faded, leaving the metal a dull gray. I paused halfway up to look out over the forest. The snow made the world seem endless, a smooth white that swallowed the smaller hills and trees. From this height, the forest looked almost uniform, but I knew the terrain below was full of hidden ravines and frozen streams. One wrong step could be dangerous if someone tried to traverse it without proper gear. By late afternoon, I finished my inspection. The tower itself needed only minor repairs, a loose railing on the stairs, and a few boards on the observation platform. I noted them in my log and took photographs for the maintenance team scheduled to come in spring. As I descended, I noticed the tracks from the animal earlier had led close to the cabin, but then disappeared into a stand of pines. Something about their sudden stop gave me pause. I assumed the fox had burrowed into a den under the snow. With the work done, I returned to my truck, which had been partially buried by new drifts while I was in the tower. I shoveled around the tires, cleared a path, and got it started. The engine grumbled and coughed, but eventually warmed up and began to move steadily. I drove slowly back down the road, feeling the quiet of the forest all around me. There was a certain weight to the silence, a stillness that made each crunch of snow under the tires seem louder. By early evening, I had reached a small pullout where I decided to spend the night. The winter weather made it too risky to return to the ranger station after dark. I parked facing east so the morning sun would hit the windshield, unpacked my sleeping bag, and settled in. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly, brushing the tops of the pines and sending faint groans through the trees. Inside the truck, it was warm from the residual engine heat, and I allowed myself to relax. Around 2:14 a.m., I woke suddenly. At first, I thought I had heard the engine start again, but then realized the sound was coming from the back of the cab. There was a low, mechanical click followed by static. I sat upright, heart pounding, scanning the darkness outside. My radio had been removed years ago, and there was no cell service in this part of the forest. Then, through the static, a voice came, a weather report. Calm, precise, and accurate, giving the temperature, wind speed, and a forecast down to the minute. I double-checked the clock. It matched perfectly. My first thought was that some kind of automatic sensor had been triggered, a remote station still transmitting. But I knew no such equipment had been functional here for decades. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting in the truck, bundled in layers and trying to make sense of it. Eventually, the static faded, leaving only the wind in the trees. By dawn, I was exhausted but relieved the strange broadcast had stopped. I packed up and drove back down to the main road, noting the event in my log in careful detail, and filed a report with my supervisor. The strange radio transmission never happened again. Later, the maintenance team came in spring, repaired the tower, and everything returned to normal. The forest remained silent, the animals kept their trails, and I returned to my usual patrols. Looking back, I realized the experience was less about danger and more about the isolation inherent in these remote posts. The way the forest can make a person hyper-aware, alert to details that would be ignored elsewhere. That night taught me how alone and vulnerable one could feel in the wilderness, even with nothing supernatural occurring, and it was a lesson I never forgot in the years I continued working those mountains. I had been working as a park ranger for just over 5 years by the time I was assigned to the backcountry section of the Sawtooth National Forest in Idaho. The area was notoriously rugged, with dense stands of lodgepole pine and fir, jagged granite outcrops, and hidden valleys that most people never saw. My assignment that late summer was routine on paper. Inspect several remote trailheads, check for illegal camping, make sure the water sources were clean, and report any trail erosion or hazards. I was used to long days and weeks of solitude, so the isolation didn't bother me. What had bothered me was that this area had almost no cell coverage, no power, and was completely off the grid. I liked the quiet, but it always left me feeling exposed, like the forest could watch me without me noticing. I started my patrol from the main ranger station near the Salmon River, driving a beat-up Ford Ranger that had more miles than I care to admit. My first stop was a trailhead near an old logging road that led to a series of alpine lakes. The parking lot was empty, as expected, except for one abandoned camper van that looked like it had been there for years. I noted it in my report, circled the area for any signs of recent activity, and found none. The tires were flat, the windows dusty, and the license plate was so rusted it was unreadable. It was the kind of thing that normally wouldn't bother me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had left it behind on purpose. The hike up to the lakes was steep. Loose rocks littered the trail, and a thick canopy of trees blocked most of the sun. I kept my boots planted carefully, scanning for signs of wildlife or other hikers. I had packed my usual supplies, 2 liters of water, a first aid kit, a small food ration, a map, and a compass. My radio was mounted on my shoulder, though the battery was nearly dead and the frequency was unreliable this far from the ranger station. The trail got progressively narrower as I climbed, and soon I was only a few hundred feet above tree line, where the wind cut sharply and the pine scent gave way to wet stone and cold air. That afternoon, I reached one of the smaller lakes and set down my pack. The water was a striking turquoise, fed by snow melt from the high peaks. I was there to inspect the area for erosion and to check for any signs of illegal fishing or camping. What I noticed immediately were the footprints, dozens of them, leading from the lake into the dense trees on the far side. They were fresh, probably made that morning, and they were small, suggesting someone was hiking lightly, possibly barefoot or in thin shoes. That made my skin crawl because this lake was so remote. It wasn't on most maps, and no official trail led through that section. Whoever had made those prints had come a long way off any known path. I marked the location in my notes and photographed the prints. I didn't follow them. This was policy, and it was safer to report unusual activity than to chase it alone. I made my way to a second lake farther up, and the wind picked up. Clouds were rolling in fast, which was common in the mountains, but still unpredictable. I set up a temporary camp near a granite outcrop that offered some shelter. I started taking notes about the erosion near the shoreline, how the soil was shifting from previous campers making fire pits, and the effects on nearby shrubs. I made sure to document everything carefully because my reports often determined whether the Forest Service would spend money on restoration. Around mid-afternoon, the wind brought a low, rhythmic tapping sound. At first, I thought it was just the pines rubbing together, but it was too regular, almost deliberate. I scanned the trees, but there was nothing visible. By then, I had learned not to panic in the woods. Noise often came from the wind, animals, or rocks falling. Still, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The weather turned quickly. Within 30 minutes, the clouds became dark and heavy, and a light drizzle started. I packed up my gear and headed back toward the trailhead. The hike down was slippery, and I had to be careful not to twist an ankle. My radio finally picked up a weak signal as I descended into a lower elevation. I reported my location and status, letting the main station know I was heading back and would check in again in an hour. That was standard procedure, and it gave me some comfort. The walk back was mostly uneventful until I reached the old logging road near the abandoned camper van again. That's when I noticed tire tracks in the dirt. Recent tire tracks large enough for a pickup or SUV. They came from nowhere, curved around the van, and disappeared into the trees. No one should have been out there, and I felt a sudden rush of adrenaline. I double-checked my map, retraced the tracks with my eyes, and confirmed they didn't connect to any road. Whoever had driven that vehicle had gone deep into the forest, far beyond where most people ventured. By the time I reached my truck, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the forest. I started the engine and drove slowly back toward the ranger station, constantly scanning the roadside for signs of movement. Nothing appeared, though I stayed on high alert until I was back on the main forest road. Once I arrived, I documented everything in a full report. The abandoned camper van, the fresh footprints near the lake, the mysterious tire tracks. I made recommendations for a follow-up patrol in that sector to investigate further. I finished my shift around 8 p.m., cleaned my gear, and reviewed the day's observations. Even after a hot meal and a shower, the unease lingered, but I reminded myself of one thing I had learned as a park ranger. The forest has secrets, but it's real people and real actions that usually create the oddest, most frightening situations. That night, I slept soundly in my small ranger cabin, knowing the next patrol would be the one to unravel what had happened, but satisfied that I had done my job thoroughly and safely. It was mid-September, and I had just started the early morning shift at the small ranger station on the northern edge of the forest. The air was crisp, almost biting, with the scent of wet pine needles and fallen leaves. The forest was quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears until even small sounds, the rustle of a squirrel, the snap of a twig, feel unnaturally loud. My assignment for the day was simple: Patrol the trail that ran along the ridge above the old logging road. Check for fallen trees or blocked paths, and make sure campers and hikers hadn't strayed into restricted areas. I had walked that trail hundreds of times before, but something about the early autumn light made everything feel different, almost sharper and more alive. I left the ranger station just after 7 a.m., my boots crunching over the frost-hardened leaves on the dirt path. My backpack was heavy with essentials: water, first aid kit, map, a small pair of binoculars, a notebook, and a flare gun. I usually didn't carry the flare gun unless I was on the more remote trails, but that morning I had the extra weight anyway. I told myself it was precaution, but part of me felt that unease in my chest, the one you get when you know a trail has been empty too long, when the wind shifts strangely and the forest suddenly feels bigger than usual. About 2 miles in, I passed a section of the trail that had been partially washed out by recent rains. Normally, it wouldn't be much of a problem, just some loose rocks and mud, but that morning it looked different, unstable in a way that made me slow my pace. The ridge overlooked a narrow valley below, and the mist from the creek snaking through it gave everything a muted gray cast. As I moved carefully along the edge of the trail, I noticed something unusual: tire tracks cutting through the mud where no vehicles were supposed to go. The tracks weren't fresh. They had dried enough to leave a crust, but they weren't months old either. That meant someone had driven a vehicle into a restricted area sometime in the past few days. I jotted it down in my notebook, noting the size and spacing of the tracks. They were too wide for a regular sedan, more likely a pickup truck or small SUV. I continued along the trail, keeping my eyes peeled for any signs of human presence. That's when I saw it: a small pile of trash pushed up against a tree. Empty water bottles, a few crushed snack wrappers, and a half-broken camping stove. It wasn't unusual to find litter, but something about the way it was stacked, almost hidden, gave me pause. Whoever had been here had tried to leave it discreetly. I took a photograph for the report, then packed it into a small plastic bag I carried for evidence. The sun had climbed higher, and the fog in the valley had started to lift, revealing more of the forest floor and the old logging road below. I decided to follow the ridge a bit further to get a better vantage point. The trail narrowed sharply, with a steep drop-off on my left. The ground was slick from the morning frost, and I had to place each foot carefully, testing every step before putting my weight down. Halfway along this section, I noticed a faint sound, like a low hum, rhythmic, coming from the valley. At first, I thought it was a trick of the wind, but as I stopped and strained to listen, it became clear. It was the engine of a vehicle, moving slowly, as if creeping through the forest. I ducked behind a cluster of young pines and watched. Down in the clearing, a truck emerged, the same size I had guessed from the tire tracks. The driver was moving slowly, sticking close to the trees, not using the logging road, but instead cutting across the open space where hikers sometimes wandered. I didn't recognize the truck, and there was no company or forest permit sticker visible. I felt a twinge of worry. The forest was quiet, and anyone driving recklessly here could easily get stuck, damage the land, or worse, hurt someone. I took a deep breath, then carefully made my way down to intercept it at the nearest junction. By the time I reached the old fork in the trail, the truck had disappeared around a bend, leaving deep ruts in the mud and a faint smell of exhaust lingering in the air. I followed cautiously, my boots sinking slightly with each step, keeping the truck's path in sight. The trail led into a more densely wooded area, where the canopy almost completely blocked the sun. The engine noise had stopped, but the truck had left a clear trail of destruction: broken branches, flattened brush, and deep tire tracks cutting through the soft ground. It was clear that whoever had been driving was careless, maybe desperate, and possibly unaware of the damage they were causing. After about half an hour of tracking, I found the truck abandoned in a small clearing. The engine was off, and no one was around. The doors were slightly ajar, and inside, I found supplies scattered on the seats: sleeping bags, a backpack, and several empty food containers. It looked like someone had been camping illegally and had left in a hurry. I documented everything carefully, photographing the tracks, the damage, and the vehicle itself. The sun was low now, golden and fading, and the forest was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. I called it in to the main station, reporting the abandoned vehicle and the damage. Rangers were dispatched to retrieve it, and by the time I returned to my station, the sky was darkening. The forest had returned to its normal rhythm. The occasional bird calling from the treetops, the distant rush of the creek, and the wind whispering through the leaves. I made notes in my journal, describing every detail of the day: the tracks, the trash, the abandoned truck. It had been tense and strange, but in the end, everything had a clear resolution. The vehicle would be removed, the area would be assessed for repair, and the report would serve as a warning to anyone thinking they could ignore the rules of the forest. By the time I locked up the station, I felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The forest was still, but I knew that vigilance mattered. Even in a place so calm and isolated, people's carelessness could leave a mark. It was my job to notice those marks, to track them, and to make sure the forest remained safe for everyone. That day reminded me that being a ranger wasn't about grand adventures or dramatic rescues. It was about the quiet, constant responsibility, the small acts that preserved the balance of the land. And as I drove home in the fading light, the smell of pine and earth still clinging to my jacket, I felt that I had done exactly that. I had been a park ranger for almost 6 years by the time the incident happened, mostly in remote areas where few people ever ventured. It was late September, around 2009, and I was stationed at a small, rugged park in northern Idaho. The forests there were dense, full of old-growth pines and cedars, with narrow dirt roads winding through valleys and along rivers. The job was mostly solitary, but that was the part one liked. It gave me time to observe wildlife, track changes in the forest, and handle emergencies when they came. Most days were quiet, almost peaceful, but there were always moments that reminded me how unpredictable nature could be. That day, I was on a routine patrol in one of the more remote sections of the park. The area was part of an old fire management zone that hadn't been maintained for decades. The roads were rough and often overgrown, and I usually had to drive very slowly, keeping an eye out for fallen trees or washouts from early autumn rains. My truck's engine hummed as I navigated a narrow stretch along a creek, the tires crunching over loose gravel. The air smelled damp and earthy, with a faint scent of decaying leaves and pine needles. I had planned to check several boundary markers that were due for replacement and to inspect a small footbridge over the creek that had been reported as unstable. I parked the truck near a bend in the creek where the road had narrowed and trees leaned over the edge of the bank. The sun was just starting to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows through the dense foliage. I grabbed my field pack, which held my radio, first aid kit, a flashlight, and some water, and began walking along the creek toward the footbridge. The path was slippery with moss and wet leaves, and I had to step carefully to avoid twisting an ankle. As I approached the bridge, I noticed that one of the support beams had rotted almost completely through. The wooden planks creaked under my weight, and I immediately marked the area with caution tape I carried for emergency use. I also snapped a few photos with my field camera, noting the GPS coordinates for the maintenance crew. After finishing the inspection, I decided to follow the creek upstream for a while. I wanted to see if erosion from the recent storms had caused any further damage to the surrounding trail. The creek curved through a narrow gorge, and the forest was nearly silent except for the sound of water trickling over rocks and the occasional rustle of a squirrel in the underbrush. I had been walking for about an hour when I noticed something unusual. There were faint tire tracks in the soft mud along the creek bank, the sort that would have come from a four-wheel drive vehicle. It wasn't completely uncommon. Some hunters and off-roaders occasionally ignored park rules, but something about these tracks made me uneasy. They were fresh, and they veered off toward a small side trail I didn't recognize. Normally, I would have followed them for a short distance to mark them and report later, but the fading light made the woods feel tighter and more confined. Despite the unease, curiosity pushed me forward. I followed the tracks up the side trail, which narrowed quickly into a steep, rocky incline. The underbrush scratched at my arms and legs, and the ground was unstable in places, but the tracks continued, showing that someone had driven a small ATV or a similar off-road vehicle recently. I kept my flashlight ready, though I hadn't turned it on yet. The canopy of trees overhead blocked most of the remaining sunlight, and shadows pooled along the trail. After climbing for about 20 minutes, I reached a small clearing at the top of the ridge. There was a shallow depression in the center, almost like someone had parked a vehicle there for a while. Around it were scattered remnants of a campsite. Empty soda cans, a couple of charred pieces of wood from a fire that had clearly burned a few days prior, and a small backpack that had been left behind. No one was there now, but I could see signs that someone had been in the area very recently. The emptiness of the clearing was unsettling. It felt isolated, as if I had walked into a part of the forest that had been forgotten. I decided to head back before it got too dark. On the way down, my foot slipped on a wet rock, and I fell hard against the slope. I checked myself carefully. Nothing broken, but my jacket was torn, and I had a few scratches on my arms. My heart was racing more from the tension of the situation than from the fall. By the time I returned to the truck, the forest was almost pitch black. I started the engine and drove slowly back toward the main road, scanning the sides with my headlights. There was nothing, no signs of anyone, no movement. The next day, I reported the abandoned campsite and the fresh tracks to my supervisor. A maintenance crew was sent to check the bridge, and a ranger patrol later investigated the clearing. They found the remnants I had seen and confirmed the tracks were from a small ATV, but there were no signs of any illegal activity, no weapons, no drugs, nothing dangerous. The person or people who had left the campsite had clearly moved on, leaving only traces of their presence. The experience stayed with me for weeks. I realized that sometimes the forest feels threatening simply because it's vast and unpredictable. There was no supernatural element, no ghost, just the simple fact that humans are small and vulnerable in a place as remote as that ridge. The memory of the tracks, the emptiness of the clearing, and the quiet tension of the woods reminded me why vigilance was so important in my job. I returned to that section of the park several times after that, always during daylight, and never saw another sign of the campsite. The footbridge was repaired, and the trail eventually reopened, but I always remembered the way the forest felt that evening. The quiet, the isolation, and the small sense of unease that comes when you realize how alone you truly are out there. It was a lesson in paying attention, in respecting the wilderness, and in understanding that real danger doesn't need to announce itself. It simply exists quietly until it doesn't. It was late September, the air sharp and cool, and the leaves were already turning golden red in the higher elevations. I was stationed alone in a remote section of the Sawtooth National Forest in Idaho. My assignment that week was to check several old logging roads and trails that hadn't been patrolled in months, mostly to make sure no one was cutting timber illegally and that no abandoned campsites were left to cause fire hazards. I liked this kind of work, quiet, isolated, and physically demanding. I had my truck packed with basic supplies: water, a thermos of coffee, a first aid kit, some extra clothes, a flashlight, and my ranger gear. My radio had very limited range in this part of the forest, and I had learned early on not to rely on it. I started my morning with a long drive up a dirt road that wound through dense stands of lodgepole pine. The gravel was loose, and the corners were steep. I kept my speed low, because I knew one wrong turn could send the truck sliding into a ravine. My first stop was an old trailhead leading to a section of the forest that had been logged in the 1970s and then left to regrow. When I arrived, I parked on a flat patch of dirt, grabbed my notepad, and started walking. The trail was narrow and overgrown in places, but I could follow the old ruts left by logging equipment. As I walked, I noticed the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves, the quiet hum of the forest, and the occasional call of a hawk overhead. The wind was mild, but it pushed through the trees in a way that made them creak. I made my way to an abandoned campsite marked on an old map as a forester's cabin, though by now there was nothing more than a stone foundation and a collapsed roof. The place was littered with rusted cans and broken glass. I documented everything carefully taking photos and notes, and made sure there were no signs of recent human activity. Everything was still and undisturbed. I spent the afternoon walking further down the trail toward a steep ridge that overlooked a small valley. The ridge offered a clear view of a section of the forest I hadn't patrolled in over a year. From this vantage point, I could see the glint of a creek running through the valley, a small herd of deer grazing near the water, and the dense forest climbing the opposite slope. It was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant sound of water. I stopped to rest, leaned against a pine, and pulled out my thermos. The coffee was lukewarm, but it helped. After a while, I continued along the ridge. The trail became faint, almost non-existent, covered in fallen branches and pine needles. At one point, I had to scramble over a large fallen tree. My boots sank slightly into the damp soil, and I had to be careful with each step as the ground was uneven and steep in places. I was tired but felt alert. I had been walking for nearly 6 hours by the time I reached the top of a small rise that looked down onto another old logging road. The road was partly washed out by recent rain, but it was navigable if I stayed careful. That's when I noticed it, a thin plume of smoke rising from the trees below. My stomach tightened. Fires were the last thing any ranger wanted to see in late September. I hurried down the slope, moving carefully over rocks and under branches. As I got closer, I could make out a small campfire that had been lit recently. There were footprints leading to it, and I could see remnants of a small tarp and some supplies scattered around. Someone had been here very recently. My first thought was that they could have left it unattended, and the fire could spread quickly in these dry conditions. I quickly took out my portable fire extinguisher and put out the fire, stamping on the embers with my boots. The smell of smoke hung in the air, sharp and acrid. After ensuring the fire was fully extinguished, I checked the surrounding area. There was no one around. The footprints suggested 1 or 2 people had been there, but they were heading deeper into the forest. I followed the tracks for a short distance, but they vanished into a dense thicket. I took photographs and made detailed notes in my log, marking the location of the campsite and the fire. I also noted that the tarp and supplies were left behind, possibly abandoned in a hurry. By the time I returned to my truck, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the road. I felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. I had dealt with the potential fire, but the presence of strangers in a remote area always left me uneasy. Driving back down the gravel road, I reflected on how quickly things could turn dangerous out here. One misstep, one spark, and the entire slope could have gone up in flames. When I finally reached my ranger station, I filed a full report with the forest supervisor. I included the location of the abandoned campsite, the footprints, and the extinguished fire. Later that evening, I checked in by radio with another ranger who patrolled a nearby section. We agreed to follow up in the next few days to ensure no one had returned and that the area remained safe. I made sure my truck was stocked, my equipment checked, and my gear ready for the next day. That night, I slept in my truck, windows cracked slightly to let in the cool air, listening to the forest settle around me. The wind rustled the pine needles, distant animals moved through the underbrush, and the creek below murmured faintly. I felt tired but satisfied. I had done my job, kept the forest safe, and handled a potentially dangerous situation without anyone getting hurt. It wasn't dramatic or thrilling in a supernatural sense, but it was real, and in this job, that reality could be just as intense as any horror story. The next morning, I returned to the campsite with another ranger. The tarp and supplies were gone, and the area looked undisturbed. No signs of a new fire. Everything was exactly as it should be. I logged the final check, packed my equipment, and headed back toward the main road. The forest seemed calm, almost indifferent, but I knew the work we did mattered. Even in the quietest, most remote corners of the world, vigilance was everything. It was late October, and I had been assigned to patrol a remote section of the Sawtooth National Forest in Idaho. The leaves had mostly fallen, leaving the slopes covered in brown and yellow litter, and the early morning mist clung to the valleys like smoke. I was alone that day, My truck parked at the edge of a gravel service road that wound deep into the forest, and I had a full day ahead of checking fire lines, maintaining trail markers, and inspecting a few old cabins that were still technically under park jurisdiction. The first part of the day was uneventful. I walked the ridge trails, checking for signs of illegal hunting or campers who had overstayed the allowed period. The forest was quiet, the usual sounds of birds and squirrels subdued by the crisp, cold air. I found a few scattered beer cans near a creek, but nothing serious, probably just weekend hikers leaving a mess. The trail markers were all intact, and the old fire line showed no recent signs of burn. By midday, I decided to check one of the old lookout towers that had been decommissioned in the late 1990s. It was perched on a hill with a commanding view of the surrounding forest. From the ground, it looked stable enough, but I had been warned in the briefing that the interior stairs were rotted and the wiring had long since been removed. No power, no radio, nothing except the metal structure itself. When I arrived, the wind had picked up, making the skeletal tower sway slightly in the breeze. I tied my pack securely, checked my flashlight and radio, though I knew it wouldn't work here, and started to climb. The wood creaked under my weight, each step a reminder to be careful. I reached the top and stepped out onto the platform. The view was incredible, even under the gray sky. I could see the valley stretching out below me, patches of snow already visible in the shadows of the taller peaks. I took a few pictures for the report I'd file later, noting the condition of the tower. The floorboards were old, some boards missing entirely, but the structure itself seemed sound enough for a brief inspection. I spent an hour walking around the perimeter of the tower, checking the old logbooks that someone had left behind decades ago. The entries were sparse, just routine reports about weather, fire sightings, and occasional mentions of hikers. There was nothing recent. The last entry was from the 1980s. I made some notes in my own field book and started to pack up. By then, the sun had dipped behind a thick bank of clouds, and the forest below was turning dark quickly. I decided not to linger too long. The temperature was dropping, and I didn't want to get caught up here after dark. I descended carefully, keeping my weight low and my steps deliberate. When I reached the ground, I noticed the wind had died down and the forest had gone completely silent. Even the birds seemed gone. I brushed it off, assuming they had settled for the evening. I loaded my pack into the truck and started the engine, planning to head back toward the main ranger station. The road was narrow and winding, the kind that force you to drive slowly, especially with loose gravel and fallen leaves. About 20 minutes in, I noticed something strange. A low, static-like noise was coming through my truck's old AM radio, the one I had left for emergency weather alerts. I hadn't touched it, and there had been no power to the tower, so I wasn't expecting anything. The static got louder for a few seconds, then suddenly a voice came through, clear and calm. It was a weather report giving the temperature, wind speed, and precipitation forecast, accurate down to the minute. I checked my watch. The report was correct. I had no explanation. The truck was running, but the antenna was bent, and I hadn't heard of any remote broadcast system working in this part of the forest. It was unnerving, but I decided to focus on getting back safely rather than pondering it. The rest of the drive was tense. Every shadow along the road made me slow down. Every rustle in the trees made me alert. I thought about the tower, the empty logbooks, the sudden voice on the radio, and I realized that the forest had a way of making you feel smaller than you were, more alone than you should. But it wasn't supernatural. There was a rational explanation waiting somewhere, and that thought kept me grounded. I finally reached the main road, and by then the night had fallen completely. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating only a few dozen feet ahead. I pulled into the ranger station parking lot and stepped out, stretching my legs and checking the truck. Everything seemed normal. I filed my notes, made a brief report about the static on the radio, and secured the truck for the night. As I lay in my bunk later, listening to the wind against the windows, I thought about the day. The forest had reminded me of how alone you could feel in it, how quickly a normal day could become tense and unsettling, even without any real danger. There were no ghosts, no monsters, just the weight of isolation. the unpredictability of the elements, and the way your mind fills in gaps when you're alone in the dark. It was a lesson in respect and caution. I knew I would go back the next day, climb the tower again if necessary, check the trails, inspect the old cabins. That was the job. And even though the forest could feel threatening, it was also a place of order, of rules, of patterns you could learn and rely on. By sunrise, the air had turned crisp again, and the forest looked inviting rather than ominous. The tension of a night receded. I packed my gear and headed back to the trails, feeling more prepared, more aware, but not afraid. The day was normal. The forest was just itself, vast, quiet, and patient. And that was enough. I was working a late-season patrol in the northern Idaho backcountry in early November of 2011. The forest was already deep into fall, with the first dustings of snow on the ground and the mornings cold enough to frost over the inside of my water bottle. My assignment that week was to check on a series of old logging roads and trails that hadn't been used much in years, making sure that the gates were secure, that there were no illegal off-road vehicles tearing up the forest, and that hikers and hunters were following the rules. The office had sent me out solo because it was a quiet week. Most of the seasonal crews had already gone home for the year. I didn't mind. I liked the solitude. It let me move at my own pace and notice things most people missed. I started early, around 6 in the morning, driving my truck up one of the old access roads that wound between dense stands of lodgepole pine and aspen. The road was narrow and bumpy, covered with a thin layer of frost that made traction tricky in spots. I moved slowly, listening to the tires crunch and grind over frozen leaves and loose gravel. I had my binoculars on the dash, a notebook in the passenger seat, and my camera in my coat pocket. My plan was to hike a short loop on a trail that branched off the road, check on a couple of abandoned cabins that had been logged in years ago, and then finish by checking the gates back down near the highway. The first few hours passed without incident. The air was crisp, and the sun had just broken through the fog that hung low in the valley. I stopped a few times to note signs of wildlife, deer tracks, the faint trail of a coyote, and some squirrel nests tucked into the lower branches of the pines. One cabin I passed was little more than a collapsed frame with a rusted stove leaning in the corner. I photographed the roof beams that had fallen inward and scribbled a note about its coordinates and condition. Everything felt normal, the kind of quiet I was used to in the forest, where the only sounds were birds, wind in the trees, and the occasional creak of an old log under my boots. By late afternoon, I reached the far end of the road near a small creek that curved through the valley. I parked and decided to hike along the creek to see how the water levels were after the recent rains. The forest narrowed here, and the undergrowth was thicker. Fallen trees blocked parts of the trail, and I had to duck and step over branches. The light was fading faster than I expected. I carried a flashlight in my pack, but I liked to hike while there was still some daylight, so I could make mental notes about the terrain and obstacles. About an hour into the stretch, I noticed something unusual. There was a faint trail of disturbed earth along the bank of the creek, almost like someone had dragged something heavy through the mud. At first, I thought it might be an old logging sled or even evidence of illegal hunting. The tracks weren't human. They were wider, almost like something with hooves, but irregular, as if the animal had slipped or struggled. I crouched and examined them. They led toward a thicket of alder and young spruce, then vanished into the shadows. I made a note in my book, photographing them carefully with my flashlight. The forest was growing darker, and I knew I needed to start heading back to the truck. I followed the trail in the general direction I had come, but after 20 minutes I realized I had misjudged the turns in the creek and was further upstream than I thought. My GPS signal was spotty under the dense canopy, so I relied on my compass and my memory of the terrain. The creek bent in several sharp turns, and the undergrowth was dense enough that I had to push branches aside constantly. I had been walking in silence, hearing only the sound of water and the occasional snapping twig underfoot, when I noticed a large fallen tree spanning the creek ahead. It was thick, moss-covered, and slippery. I carefully tested each step before crossing, leaning on my walking stick. About halfway across, I heard a low, guttural sound. almost like a growl but muffled by the trees. My heart jumped. I froze and scanned the area with my flashlight. Nothing moved. The sound came again, quieter, closer. It wasn't a coyote or a wolf. I had been trained to recognize their calls, and this was deeper, heavier. I realized there could be a large elk or moose nearby, maybe startled by me. I stayed calm, kept my flashlight on the ground near my feet, and moved slowly across the log. The animal, if it was one, didn't appear again. Once across, I regained the trail and decided to take a wider, more familiar path back toward the road. The sun had fully set, and I relied on my headlamp to navigate. It was easy to lose the trail in this section. The undergrowth was thick, and fallen trees crisscrossed the path. About 30 minutes later, I finally saw the faint glow of my truck's headlights through the trees. Relief washed over me. I moved faster, eager to get back to warmth and radio contact. I reached the truck and unlocked it, shaking off branches and brushing mud from my boots. I started the engine, the heater kicking in immediately, and sat for a moment, listening to the quiet hum. I thought about the tracks I had seen and the sound I had heard. Whatever it was, it hadn't followed me, and the forest had returned to its usual calm. I documented everything in my notebook, took photos, and made a full report for the office. I drove back down the gravel road, careful of the frost patches, and locked the gates behind me. By the time I returned to the ranger station, it was nearly 10 p.m. I went through my notes, typed up the report, and filed the photos. The next morning, I returned to the same area with a small crew to investigate the tracks. They turned out to be from a large elk that had likely been injured or tangled in the undergrowth, dragging itself through the mud. The sound I had heard was probably it struggling across the fallen trees. No one had been in danger. The experience stuck with me, not because it was terrifying in the usual sense, but because it reminded me how easily you can feel isolated and unsure in the forest, even when you are experienced. It reinforced the importance of preparation, observation, and respect for the wilderness. From that point on, I carried extra equipment, stayed closer to known trails at night, and documented everything carefully. The forest hadn't been dangerous, just unpredictable. And that, in the end, is exactly why I love being a park ranger. It was late September, the air sharp and cool, and the leaves were already turning gold and red in the higher elevations. I was stationed alone in a remote section of the Sawtooth National Forest in Idaho. My assignment that week was to check several old logging roads and trails that hadn't been patrolled in months, mostly to make sure no one was cutting timber illegally and that no abandoned campsites were left to cause fire hazards. I liked this kind of work, quiet, isolated, and physically demanding. I had my truck packed with basic supplies, water, a thermos of coffee, a first aid kit, some extra clothes, a flashlight, and my ranger gear. My radio had very limited range in this part of the forest, and I had learned early on not to rely on it. I started my morning with a long drive up a dirt road that wound through dense stands of lodgepole pine. The gravel was loose, and the corners were steep. I kept my speed low, because I knew one wrong turn could send the truck sliding into a ravine. My first stop was an old trailhead leading to a section of the forest that had been logged in the 1970s and then left to regrow. When I arrived, I parked on a flat patch of dirt, grabbed my notepad, and started walking. The trail was narrow and overgrown in places, but I could follow the old ruts left by logging equipment. As I walked, I noticed the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves, the quiet hum of the forest, and the occasional call of a hawk overhead. The wind was mild, but it pushed through the trees in a way that made them creak. I made my way to an abandoned campsite marked on an old map as a forester's cabin, though by now there was nothing more than a stone foundation and a collapsed roof. The place was littered with rusted cans and broken glass. I documented everything carefully, taking photos and notes, and made sure there were no signs of recent human activity. Everything was still and undisturbed. I spent the afternoon walking further down the trail toward a steep ridge that overlooked a small valley. The ridge offered a clear view of a section of the forest I hadn't patrolled in over a year. From this vantage point, I could see the glint of a creek running through the valley, a small herd of deer grazing near the water, and the dense forest climbing the opposite slope. It was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant sound of water. I stopped to rest, leaned against a pine, and pulled out my thermos. The coffee was lukewarm, but it helped. After a while, I continued along the ridge. The trail became faint, almost non-existent, covered in fallen branches and pine needles. At one point, I had to scramble over a large fallen tree. My boots sank slightly into the damp soil, and I had to be careful with each step as the ground was uneven and steep in places. I was tired but felt alert. I had been walking for nearly 6 hours by the time I reached the top of a small rise that looked down onto another old logging road. The road was partly washed out by recent rain, but it was navigable if I stayed careful. That's when I noticed it, a thin plume of smoke rising from the trees below. My stomach tightened. Fires were the last thing any ranger wanted to see in late September. I hurried down the slope, moving carefully over rocks and under branches. As I got closer, I could make out a small campfire that had been lit recently. There were footprints leading to it, and I could see remnants of a small tarp and some supplies scattered around. Someone had been here very recently. My first thought was that they could have left it unattended and the fire could spread quickly in these dry conditions. I quickly took out my portable fire extinguisher and put out the fire, stamping on the embers with my boots. The smell of smoke hung in the air, sharp and acrid. After ensuring the fire was fully extinguished, I checked the surrounding area. There was no one around. The footprints suggested 1 or 2 people had been there, but they were heading deeper into the forest. I followed the tracks for a short distance, but they vanished into a dense thicket. I took photographs and made detailed notes in my log, marking the location of the campsite and the fire. I also noted that the tarp and supplies were left behind, possibly abandoned in a hurry. By the time I returned to my truck, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the road. I felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. I had dealt with the potential fire, but the presence of strangers in a remote area always left me uneasy. Driving back down the gravel road, I reflected on how quickly things could turn dangerous out here. One misstep, one spark, and the entire slope could have gone up in flames. When I finally reached my ranger station, I filed a full report with the forest supervisor. I included the location of the abandoned campsite, the footprints, and the extinguished fire. Later that evening, I checked in by radio with another ranger who patrolled a nearby section. We agreed to follow up in the next few days to ensure no one had returned and that the area remained safe. I made sure my truck was stocked, my equipment checked, and my gear ready for the next day. That night, I slept in my truck, windows cracked slightly to let in the cool air, listening to the forest settle around me. The wind rustled the pine needles. Distant animals moved through the underbrush, and the creek below murmured faintly. I felt tired but satisfied. I had done my job, kept the forest safe, and handled a potentially dangerous situation without anyone getting hurt. It wasn't dramatic or thrilling in a supernatural sense, but it was real, and in this job, that reality could be just as intense as any horror story. The next morning, I returned to the campsite with another ranger. The tarp and supplies were gone, and the area looked undisturbed. No signs of a new fire. Everything was exactly as it should be. I logged the final check, packed my equipment, and headed back toward the main road. The forest seemed calm, almost indifferent, but I knew the work we did mattered. Even in the quietest, most remote corners of the world, vigilance was everything. August of 1992 was dry and bright in the mountains of western Montana. I was working a long patrol rotation with one partner, covering backcountry sections that most visitors never reached. The job was routine and slow. We checked trails, cleared fallen limbs, logged erosion, and watched for illegal camps. That week had a strange quiet to it. Fewer hikers than usual. The air felt thin and dusty. Sound carried farther. Every footstep seemed louder than it should have been. We were well past the posted park limits when we found signs that did not belong there. cut branches stacked with care, stones arranged to divert runoff. The work showed patience and skill. This was not a rushed camp. It sat in a fold of land between spruce and fir, tucked below a slope that broke the wind. Whoever built it understood drainage, shade, and concealment. It took time to notice it, even when we were close. The shelter itself was the most striking part. Logs are not hacked or split rough. They were shaped to fit, joints locked together without nails. Bark had been stripped clean and laid aside to form a roof layered with grass and soil. Smoke staining showed controlled fires burned low and clean. A trench diverted rain around the base. Everything about it suggested long use and deep knowledge of the land. The man was there when we arrived. He did not react with surprise or fear. He stood from a stool made of root wood and faced us like we were expected. His clothes were worn but mended with careful stitches. His boots were old but oiled and intact. His beard was trimmed short. His hands were clean. He looked fed and steady. He had no pack and no visible tools beyond a small blade at his belt. No trash lay around. No food wrappers. No bottles. Everything had a place. He claimed he had always been there. Not since last winter or a few years back. Always. The way he said it felt flat and practiced, like a statement rather than a belief. What unsettled me most was how much he already knew. He knew my name and my partner name before we spoke. He knew which day we covered that section and which day we did not. He knew when our radios went quiet due to terrain. He knew the truck stayed at the south turnout on this rotation. None of that information was public. It came from watching, listening, and patience. I felt exposed standing there. The woods around us no longer felt empty. They felt used. Not abused, but read and memorized. He had built himself into the land without leaving obvious marks. I realized then how little attention we paid to what lay beyond our maps. We documented what we could without provoking him. No identification was found. No permits. No signs of recent theft. No weapons that would justify immediate removal. Still, he was living far beyond the allowed boundary, and the skill of the shelter suggested long-term presence. We left with the intent to return the next morning with law enforcement and proper authority. That night, I slept poorly. I kept thinking about how long it must have taken to build that place. How many seasons passed while we walked routes nearby and never saw it? How often he watched us without being seen? The thought stayed heavy and close. We returned less than 24 hours later. Same route, same weather. The clearing where the shelter had been was empty. Not damaged, not burned, just gone. Logs were removed. Stones were scattered back into the stream bed. The trench was filled. Grass lay flattened in broad patterns as if weighted down and then lifted away. No clear footprints led out. No drag marks. No ash. The ground looked pressed by careful hands rather than trampled by haste. Law enforcement searched outward in widening circles. They found nothing. No trail. No cache. No sign of transport. It was as if the place had never existed. Only the flattened grass remained, already starting to rise. The explanation came slowly and without mystery. The man had studied us for years. He knew when patrols passed and when they did not. He likely copied names from reports, license plates, and gear tags. He could have listened to radio chatter from high ground. His shelter was designed to be dismantled. Each piece served more than one purpose. Logs doubled as carrying poles. Stones were native and easily returned. The grass roof could be lifted in sheets and laid flat to erase shape. He left during the night or early morning when wind and dew softened traces. He did not vanish. He moved. He went deeper or farther or simply beyond our reach. The land allowed it because he treated it with care. The fear came not from the unknown, but from the realization that someone could live alongside us, observe us, and leave without a trace because they understood the terrain better than we did. The case closed with a simple note about an illegal inhabitant who relocated before removal. No follow-up was possible. I carried the memory with me long after that summer. It changed how I walked patrols. I looked at the ground more closely. I listened harder. I accepted that the wilderness holds people as well as animals, and some of them know how to disappear without breaking any laws of nature at all. I had been assigned to patrol a remote section of forest in northern Idaho during the late fall of 2009. The area was rugged, with steep ridges and narrow valleys, and most of the trails weren't maintained for anything more than hiking in the summer. My job was to check for illegal hunting, monitor wildlife, and ensure the fire towers and ranger cabins were in working order. That particular week, temperatures had already dropped below freezing at night, and patches of snow clung to the north-facing slopes, making the terrain slippery and unpredictable. I started my morning at the ranger station just as the first light hit the treetops. The station itself was a small, weather-beaten building perched on the edge of a creek. I loaded my truck with the usual gear: first aid kit, chainsaw, spare fuel, food for the day, my ranger radio, and plenty of water. I also carried a large pair of binoculars, a notepad, and a map marked with areas that had been reported for trespassing or illegal activity. The plan was to check a series of old logging roads that had fallen into disuse over the years. I drove slowly along the dirt track, listening to the crunch of gravel under my tires. The forest was quiet. The only sounds were the wind rattling dry leaves and the occasional distant snap of a branch. I had done this route many times before, but there was always a tension that comes with being alone in a forest this vast. After about an hour, I noticed some fresh tire tracks on a narrow spur road that hadn't been used in months. They looked recent, maybe a day or two old, and they didn't match any vehicle I was aware of in the area. I parked my truck at the entrance to the spur and stepped out. The air was sharp and cold. I pulled on my gloves and boots and grabbed my flashlight and radio. I planned to follow the tracks for a short distance to see where they led, but I stayed cautious, knowing hunters sometimes ignored all rules and regulations. The tracks led uphill through dense pines. The ground was uneven, with fallen logs and rocks hidden under the leaf litter, forcing me to step carefully. After about 20 minutes, I came to a small clearing where the tracks disappeared entirely. The clearing had a half-collapsed cabin, probably abandoned for decades. The roof sagged under the weight of old snow, and the walls were covered in moss. I walked around the structure, checking the perimeter. There were signs of someone being there recently. A small fire pit with cold ashes, footprints pressed into soft earth, and a pile of discarded cans. I took pictures and marked the location in my notebook. My instinct told me someone had been staying there illegally. It wasn't uncommon. This area attracted people who wanted to live off the grid or poach deer without risking detection. I checked my radio and tried the ranger channel, but reception was patchy in this valley. I sent a brief report to the station and decided to keep moving, wanting to cover as much ground before dark as possible. The sun was low when I reached the old fire tower at the top of the ridge. It was a steel structure, probably built in the 1930s, with a small cabin at the top used for spotting fires. I climbed the rickety metal stairs, each step groaning under my weight. From the top, the view stretched for miles, the valleys and ridges bathed in orange and purple light. I spent a few minutes scanning the horizon, checking for smoke or any signs of human activity. Nothing moved except for a pair of hawks circling far off in the distance. I took some notes and pictures, then made my way back down, careful with every step as the cold made the metal icy and slippery. By the time I got back to my truck, shadows were falling across the forest. I decided to take a short side trail that led down to a creek I was monitoring. The creek was shallow, but vital for the wildlife in this area. As I walked along the bank, I noticed tracks in the mud, smaller this time, human but lighter. They were fresh. I followed them for a short distance, curiosity mixing with a cautious tension. The track stopped at the base of a rock ledge, which I climbed carefully. On top, there was an old hunting blind, abandoned and partially collapsed. Whoever had been here had clearly moved on recently, leaving nothing but empty shells and torn food packaging. The temperature dropped quickly, and I knew I needed to get back before the last light disappeared completely. I checked my watch. It was nearly 5:30 p.m., and the sun would be gone in less than an hour. I started back along the trail, my headlamp ready, and noticed how quiet the forest had become. Every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves made me pause. When I reached my truck, I felt a sense of relief. The vehicle was exactly as I'd left it. I got in, started the engine, and began the slow drive back down the logging road. On the way back, I thought about the people who had been in those abandoned structures. They had come into this forest for their own reasons, but without understanding the risks. This area was harsh, and winter came early. I realized the forest wasn't dangerous because of ghosts or myths. It was dangerous because of the environment itself. Cold, isolation, steep terrain, and human mistakes. When I finally reached the main ranger station, the sun had disappeared entirely, leaving a deep twilight across the mountains. I filed my report, attached the photos, and logged the locations of the abandoned structures. Later, as I cleaned my gear, I felt a quiet satisfaction. My day had been long and tense, but everything was accounted for, and the forest remained as it should, untouched except for the signs of human carelessness. It was a simple day in the life of a park ranger, filled with observation, caution, and a deep respect for the wilderness. There was no heroism, no dramatic rescue, just routine vigilance and careful attention to detail. I locked up the station, took one last look at the dark outline of the mountains, and drove home. I knew the forest would be there the next day, waiting for me to return, and I felt ready to face it again, fully aware of its quiet power and relentless reality. I was assigned a week-long solo patrol in the highlands of Montana in late September of 2010. The park had stretches of dense pine forests, rocky outcrops, and narrow trails that few visitors dared to hike. My duty was mostly routine: check on trail conditions, inspect fire lookouts, and ensure campers were following regulations, but I had a feeling something unusual might happen this week. I had spent years on these trails, and even after all that time, the solitude of the forest at night never stopped feeling heavy. I arrived early in the morning, just after sunrise, and parked my truck at the small ranger station at the edge of the park. The air was cold, with the first hints of autumn in the wind. I carried my backpack with the essentials: radio, flashlight, first aid kit, maps, and a thermos of coffee. My first task was to hike up to an old fire tower I had been assigned to inspect. The trail leading up was steep, littered with pine needles and loose rocks. Every step I took made a soft crunch, the only sound besides the wind whistling through the trees. The fire tower was built decades ago, and it had no power. The windows were grimy, the stairs creaked, and I could smell the faint scent of old wood mixed with mildew. The radio that used to be there had been removed years ago, so the tower was completely silent. I checked the structure carefully, noting any rot or weaknesses in the support beams. The view from the top was stunning. Even in autumn, the mountains stretched for miles, blanketed with yellows, reds, and greens. I sat on the edge for a while, drinking coffee, scanning the horizon. Everything looked normal. No smoke, no unusual movement, nothing out of place. I descended and decided to hike further along a service trail that ran through a more isolated section of the forest. I was mapping areas where erosion had been reported. By late afternoon, the sky had started turning a muted gray, clouds rolling in low over the ridges. I checked my watch. It was nearing 5 p.m., and I was still a few miles from my planned campsite. I decided to turn back toward my truck, moving carefully because the trail had gotten slippery from the morning dew. When I reached my truck, I parked and unloaded my gear, planning to rest for the night inside. I had the option to set up my tent, but the weather was chilly and I preferred the shelter of the vehicle. The forest around me had grown quiet. The wind had died down, leaving only the occasional sound of distant branches snapping under the weight of wildlife. I had a small lantern and set it on the dashboard. I sipped coffee and began checking maps for the next day's route. Around 2:14 a.m., I was just dozing off. That's when it happened. Behind me, from the back of the truck, I heard a soft click, almost mechanical. At first, I froze, thinking I might have left something running. Then the static started, a low crackle, faint at first but growing louder. I sat upright, heart pounding, scanning the darkness outside the windshield. I didn't see anything. Then, over the static, a voice came in. It was a weather report, clear and precise, giving the time and forecast down to the minute. I double-checked my watch. It matched exactly. I couldn't explain it. The truck had no radio signal, and my handheld was turned off to save batteries. There were no power lines anywhere near, and I'd seen that this area was completely isolated. I stayed still for a moment, listening as the report ended and the static died away. My rational brain told me it was probably some unusual atmospheric interference, but the timing was so precise, so eerily perfect, that it made my stomach tighten. After a long time, I decided to try to sleep again. I kept my flashlight within reach, just in case. The rest of the night was uneventful, but I didn't get much rest. Morning came slowly, the first light filtering through the pine trees. I packed up, double-checked my maps, and began my hike along the main trail, still thinking about what had happened. I couldn't tell anyone at the time. They would think I had imagined it. Over the next few days, I continued my patrol. I inspected the fire tower again, hiked remote trails, checked water sources, and ensured signage was intact. The forest seemed normal, quiet, isolated, and beautiful, but that moment in the truck lingered in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something about the highlands that wasn't quite explained by maps or schedules. Yet at the same time, nothing dangerous ever happened. No animals attacked, no hikers got lost near me, no storms hit unexpectedly. Everything remained within the bounds of reason. By the end of the week, I had finished my patrol, submitted my reports, and returned to the ranger station. I left the highlands with the same appreciation I always had for their solitude and beauty, but with a lingering awareness that even in places we know well, the forest has a way of surprising you. Some events can't be explained immediately, and that's fine. I learned to respect the quiet, to be cautious, and to appreciate the moments of solitude without overthinking them. I often think back to that night in the truck. The forest was completely normal, yet I had experienced something inexplicable. It wasn't supernatural or magical, just a precise anomaly in a place that demanded alertness. It reminded me why I love this job, because the forest is alive in ways that don't always make sense, and because being a ranger is about observing, respecting, and understanding the unpredictable nature of the wilderness. By the time I drove out of the park, the sun was bright over the mountains, the air crisp and fresh. I looked back once, saw the trees swaying gently in the morning breeze, and felt a calm certainty. No matter what strange things I witnessed, the work I did mattered, the land mattered, and the experience, though eerie, reminded me why I stayed. I had faced something unusual, yet I had stayed safe, kept my head, and continued on. That clarity, that steady reassurance, stayed with me long after the highlands disappeared behind me. It was early January 2016, and I was on my usual patrol in the park, driving the dusty service roads that cut across the desert. The sky was pale gray, the kind of light that makes everything seem muted and flat. The temperature had dropped overnight, leaving the sand and gravel cold under my boots. I had been alone for hours, the only sounds the low hum of the truck engine and the occasional scrape of wind carrying sand across the roads. My shift had been quiet, the kind of quiet that leaves you aware of every small movement and sound. Around mid-morning, the thermal alert came through on the mobile camera I had been monitoring. It was unusual for this time of year. The sensor showed a heat signature near one of the abandoned restrooms off the main trail. It did not have a recognizable shape, just a small, shifting warmth in the concrete structure. My gut told me to check it out. I parked the truck at the edge of the parking area and walked in, boots crunching over gravel and loose sand. The wind was light, enough to carry a dry, metallic taste across the space. The restroom was empty, the doors hanging slightly off their hinges, paint peeling in strips from the walls. I moved slowly, sweeping the flashlight across the floor and walls, trying to see any sign of the source of heat. Nothing moved. The stalls were small, lined with old concrete walls stained from years of neglect. I stepped into the first stall and paused. That was when I felt it, a subtle vibration under my feet, faint at first, almost like the thrum of a far-off engine, but irregular. I froze, bending slightly to touch the floor with my hand. The concrete was solid, but I could feel movement beneath it, slow and deliberate, spreading like a wave across the ground. I stepped back, scanning the area, but the heat signature had vanished. I moved to the next stall, the vibration stronger, more insistent. It did not feel like machinery. It felt alive, but in a way I could not identify. There was nothing visible, nothing to explain the sensation. I checked the perimeter outside the building, looking for tracks or anything that could account for it. The sand was mostly smooth, disturbed only by wind patterns and scattered debris. No footprints, no tire marks. I spent over an hour circling the restroom and its immediate surroundings, trying to find any logical cause. I tapped on the walls, looked under the sinks, even checked the septic access points, but everything seemed in order. The vibrations seemed to follow me, subtle but unmistakable, like something moving beneath the concrete and sand. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise, and my pace slowed. There was a weight in the air, not oppressive but keenly noticeable, a sense of the unexpected underfoot. Eventually, I left the area, the vibration fading as I walked back to the truck. I ran the camera feed again, watching the heat signature disappear as soon as I crossed the threshold of the parking lot. It was gone, and I could not find any explanation. I marked the incident in the log and moved on to other parts of the park, the afternoon sun rising and casting long shadows across the desert floor. The next day, another ranger was assigned to the same patrol. He told me what he had found in the restroom. The concrete stalls had deep claw marks etched into the interior walls, long grooves that could only have been made from the inside. The marks were jagged, uneven, and indicated a significant amount of force. Nothing had been taken, no trash disturbed beyond what the wind could account for. He said it looked like something had been trapped inside, trying to get out. I went back later that week to see the marks for myself. They were as fresh as he described, the concrete still rough in the grooves. I ran my hands along them, feeling the uneven edges. I measured the spacing and depth, trying to picture what could have caused them. The stall dimensions were standard, not large enough for a person to crouch and claw with that intensity without leaving other signs of struggle. I returned to the surrounding area, looking for tracks or disturbances. There was nothing else, no tracks, no discarded items, nothing to explain the vibrations I had felt the day before. In retrospect, I thought about all the possibilities. Burrowing animals, seismic activity, structural shifts in the building, human pranksters. None of them fit. There were no known burrowing animals large enough to make vibrations that deep and precise under concrete. No earthquakes had been recorded. The building had been stable for decades, and the marks did not match human hands. I documented everything carefully, photographs, measurements, notes, but the mystery remained unresolved. I never felt the vibrations again, and the heat alerts never returned. I stayed away from that part of the park for weeks, giving the area a wide berth, though my curiosity gnawed at me. Every patrol, I would glance toward the abandoned restroom, half expecting to see movement or hear the subtle trembling beneath the ground. But the desert remained still, empty, and silent. The memory of that day stayed with me, a reminder that some things are real, tangible, and still impossible to explain. It was not fear from imagination. It was the unease of knowing that something had existed underfoot, had clawed from the inside, and had vanished without a trace. The incident was closed officially with a note about the unexplained marks and a recommendation for repair and monitoring. But in truth, I never stopped thinking about it. The park remained a place of sun and sand, of wind and quiet trails, but I always remembered the sensation of the vibration through the concrete, the warmth that had no form, and the evidence that something had been there, something determined enough to leave its mark and disappear without warning.